Hey there and welcome back. If you're getting cozy right now, maybe the lights are low, the world has gone a little quiet. Good, because tonight's story is one that almost everyone thinks they know, and almost no one actually does. Tonight, we are going to spend a few hours with a woman whose name you have probably said before without thinking very much about it. A woman whose face is recognizable on a million prints and tea towels and film posters. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? And if you enjoy these cozy journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. A woman who, depending on which century you ask, was either a saint, a fool, a martyr, a monster, or a kind of cautionary fairy tale dressed in silk and powder. So before we go anywhere else, I want you to imagine the morning of May 7th, 1770. You are standing on an island in the middle of the Rhine. The island is called the Île des Épis, and it is a small, flat, otherwise unremarkable strip of land between France and the territories of the Holy Roman Empire. A wooden pavilion has been constructed on it, specifically for what is about to happen. The pavilion has two anterooms, one on the Austrian side, one on the French side, and a central chamber where the ceremony will take place. You are 14 years old. You have arrived from Vienna after weeks of travel, in a procession that included 57 carriages, more than 100 mounted attendants, dozens of servants, 6 of your closest companions from childhood, your dog, and a trunk of letters from your mother. You have been told that everything Austrian about you must now be left behind. Everything. Your clothes, your jewelry, your shoes, even your underwear. Your dog, your servants, your friends, the letters, all of it. You will walk into the Austrian anteroom dressed as an archduchess of the Habsburgs, and you will walk out of the French anteroom dressed as the future Queen of France. In between, in the central chamber, you will be physically stripped, in front of witnesses, of every thread of fabric that connects you to the country of your birth. This is not metaphor. It is procedure. It actually happens, and the witnesses actually watch. Your name, until this morning, has been Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna. As of today, that name will not exist anymore. The French version, which you will be addressed by for the rest of your life, is Marie Antoinette. The change is small. The implications are total. What I want you to understand, before we go any further, is that this morning on this island, at the age of 14, was not the worst thing that ever happened to her. It was not even close. It was simply the first ritual in a life that would be defined by ritual, and by being looked at, and by being told, often in ways she could not refuse, who she was now supposed to be. The girl who stood in that wooden pavilion in the spring of 1770 had no idea what was coming. None of us, at 14, would have. And yet for the next 23 years, almost without pause, she would be required to perform a role that had been written for her by people who had never met her, in a country she had never seen, in a language that was not her first. That is where we are starting tonight, not with a queen, with a child, because everything about Marie Antoinette begins, and in some sense never quite stops being, the story of a child who was handed over. But before we can understand what was handed over, we need to spend some real time with where she came from, because the world she was leaving behind on that island in the Rhine was almost as strange and almost as constructed as the one she was walking into. And there was one person in that world who had shaped her as a sculptor shapes wet clay into something specifically designed to do what was about to happen to her. Her mother, Let us go back to Vienna. She was born on November 2nd, 1755, in the Hofburg Palace, the great Habsburg residence at the centre of the city. The day of her birth was, by a coincidence that contemporaries found unsettling, the same day a catastrophic earthquake destroyed much of Lisbon, killing tens of thousands of people and shaking the philosophical foundations of European thought. Voltaire would write a famous poem about the Lisbon earthquake. Rousseau would respond to it. The 18th century would never quite shake the question the earthquake raised, which was whether the world was, in the end, a benevolent place or simply a violent one. None of this had anything to do with the small, healthy Archduchess being born in Vienna that same Sunday, but it is one of those historical pairings that tempts you to read meaning into it. A child born on the day the earth opened, people did notice at the time, and they said things about it, and her mother is reported to have brushed those comments aside with the impatient confidence of a woman who did not have time for omens. Her mother was Maria Theresa. Maria Theresa had been born in 1717, the eldest daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI. Her father had no surviving sons, and he had spent much of his reign attempting to secure the right of his daughter to inherit the Habsburg lands through a complicated piece of legislation called the Pragmatic Sanction, which he persuaded most of the major European powers to sign. When he died in 1740, when Maria Theresa was 23, half of those powers immediately tore up their agreements and went to war over what they regarded as a now vacant throne. The result was the War of the Austrian Succession, an 8-year conflict that should, by every reasonable expectation, have ended the Habsburg dynasty as a major European power. It did not. Maria Theresa, by a combination of personal courage, shrewd alliance-making, and the sort of cold operational intelligence that great rulers are made of, held the dynasty together. By the time she was finished, she had lost the province of Silesia to Frederick the Great of Prussia, but she had kept everything else, and she had emerged from the war as a sovereign in her own right, whose authority no one in Europe seriously questioned anymore. She had also, in the middle of all this, given birth to children. 16 of them, eventually, between 1737 and 1756. 11 of them survived into adulthood. Maria Theresa loved her husband, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, with a kind of unembarrassed devotion that was unusual for European monarchs of her era. She made him co-ruler. She tolerated his minor infidelities with a public composure that was probably less private than it appeared. When he died in 1765, she cut her hair, dressed in mourning for the rest of her life, and reportedly wrote in her prayer book that she had been married to him for 29 years, 6 months, and 6 days, calculating the duration to the day. She was a woman who could be extraordinarily in her personal life and absolutely ruthless in her public one. The two settings did not contradict each other in her mind. They were simply different rooms of the same house. Marie Antoinette was the 15th of those 16 children. She arrived in a household where the older children were already being parcelled out through the courts of Europe through dynastic marriages. The Habsburg dynasty, by the mid-18th century, was less a family than a network of strategic alliances. Each daughter was a potential treaty. Each son was a potential heir to a foreign crown or a senior commander of Habsburg forces. Maria Theresa loved her children, and she also disposed of them. She had a job to do, and they were part of how she did it. The personalities of those siblings tell you something about what kind of household Marie Antoinette grew up in. The eldest surviving son, Joseph, who would become Joseph II, was an intellectual and a reformer, frequently at odds with his more cautious mother, deeply influenced by Enlightenment philosophy, abrasive in temperament, often unhappy. The second son, Leopold, who would eventually become Leopold II, was quieter, more diplomatic, more humane in his administration. Of the daughters, Maria Christina was the favourite, allowed unusually to marry for love, and granted unusual privileges as a result, which created some tension with her sisters. Maria Amalia was sent to be Duchess of Parma against her wishes, and she made the marriage a disaster of resentment that Maria Theresa never forgave. Maria Carolina, the closest in age and personality to Marie Antoinette, was sent in 1768 to marry King Ferdinand of Naples, and she would become a formidable queen consort there, ruling effectively in her husband's name for decades and remaining one of Marie Antoinette's most important correspondents through their parallel lives. And there were others, brothers and sisters of varying influence, almost all of them shaped, more or less, by their mother's powerful and somewhat exhausting attention. Marie Antoinette herself, in this large household, was not initially regarded as important. She was the youngest surviving daughter at the time of her birth. The senior dynastic marriages had already been arranged or were in the planning. Her own marriage prospects were considered modest. She was a charming child, a graceful child, a musical child. She danced beautifully. She had an instinctive grasp of how to make people like her. There is a famous story, almost certainly embellished, about a 6-year-old Mozart visiting the Schönbrunn Palace in 1762 and, after slipping on the polished floor, being helped up by the 7-year-old Marie Antoinette, to whom he is said to have proposed marriage on the spot. Whether the story is true in detail or not, it captures something accurate about her childhood. She was the type of child who attracted that kind of story. She was likable. She was at ease. What she did not have, and this is one of the cruel ironies of her later life, was a serious education. Her primary tutor in the early years was a woman named Countess Brandeis, who was warm, indulgent, and entirely unequal to the task of disciplining a charming and lazy student. Lessons were arranged, but were not always taken seriously. Handwriting practice was performed by Brandeis herself in pencil, and Marie Antoinette traced over it in ink. French composition was supervised loosely. Religious instruction was provided in a conventional and undemanding form. The young Archduchess learned, in essence, how to be a charming presence in a court setting, and how to perform the basic functions of an aristocratic European girl, and not much more. When he died in 1740, when Maria Theresa was 23, half of those powers immediately tore up their agreements and went to war over what they regarded as a now vacant throne. The result was the War of the Austrian Succession, an 8-year conflict that should, by every reasonable expectation, have ended the Habsburg dynasty as a major European power. It did not. Maria Theresa, by a combination of personal courage, shrewd alliance-making, and the sort of cold operational intelligence that great rulers are made of, held the dynasty together. By the time she was finished, she had lost the province of Silesia to Frederick the Great of Prussia, but she had kept everything else, and she had emerged from the war as a sovereign in her own right, whose authority no one in Europe seriously questioned anymore. She had also, in the middle of all this, given birth to children, 16 of them eventually between 1737 and 1756. 11 of them survived into adulthood. Maria Theresa loved her husband, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, with a kind of unembarrassed devotion that was unusual for European monarchs of her era. She made him co-ruler. She tolerated his minor infidelities with a public composure that was probably less private than it appeared. When he died in 1765, she cut her hair, dressed in mourning for the rest of her life, and reportedly wrote in her prayer book that she had been married to him for 29 years, 6 months, and 6 days, calculating the duration to the day. She was a woman who could be extraordinarily in her personal life and absolutely ruthless in her public one. The two settings did not contradict each other in her mind. They were simply different rooms of the same house. Marie Antoinette was the 15th of those 16 children. She arrived in a household where the older children were already being parcelled out through the courts of Europe through dynastic marriages. The Habsburg dynasty, by the mid-18th century, was less a family than a network of strategic alliances. Each daughter was a potential treaty. Each son was a potential heir to a foreign crown or a senior commander of Habsburg forces. Maria Theresa loved her children, and she also disposed of them. She had a job to do, and they were part of how she did it. The personalities of those siblings tell you something about what kind of household Marie Antoinette grew up in. The eldest surviving son, Joseph, who would become Joseph II, was an intellectual and a reformer, frequently at odds with his more cautious mother, deeply influenced by Enlightenment philosophy, abrasive in temperament, often unhappy. The second son, Leopold, who would eventually become Leopold II, was quieter, more diplomatic, more humane in his administration. Of the daughters, Maria Christina was the favourite, allowed unusually to marry for love, and granted unusual privileges as a result, which created some tension with her sisters. Maria Amalia was sent to be Duchess of Parma against her wishes, and she made the marriage a disaster of resentment that Maria Theresa never forgave. Maria Carolina, the closest in age and personality to Marie Antoinette, was sent in 1768 to marry King Ferdinand of Naples, and she would become a formidable queen consort there, ruling effectively in her husband's name for decades, and remaining one of Marie Antoinette's most important correspondents through their parallel lives. And there were others, brothers and sisters of varying influence, almost all of them shaped more or less by their mother's powerful and somewhat exhausting attention. Marie Antoinette herself, in this large household, was not initially regarded as important. She was the youngest surviving daughter at the time of her birth. The senior dynastic marriages had already been arranged or were in the planning. Her own marriage prospects were considered modest. She was a charming child, a graceful child, a musical child. She danced beautifully. She had an instinctive grasp of how to make people like her. There is a famous story, almost certainly embellished, about a 6-year-old Mozart visiting the Schönbrunn Palace in 1762, and, after slipping on the polished floor, being helped up by the 7-year-old Marie Antoinette, to whom he is said to have proposed marriage on the spot. Whether the story is true in detail or not, it captures something accurate about her childhood. She was the type of child who attracted that kind of story. She was likable. She was at ease. What she did not have, and this is one of the cruel ironies of her later life, was a serious education. Her primary tutor in the early years was a woman named Countess Brandeis, who was warm, indulgent, and entirely unequal to the task of disciplining a charming and lazy student. Lessons were arranged, but were not always taken seriously. Handwriting practice was performed by Brandeis herself, in pencil, and Marie Antoinette traced over it in ink. French composition was supervised loosely. Religious instruction was provided in a conventional and undemanding form. The young Archduchess learned, in essence, how to be a charming presence in a court setting, and how to perform the basic functions of an aristocratic European girl, and not much more. But this would become a problem rather suddenly in 1767, when Maria Antonia was 11 years old, because the entire Habsburg marriage strategy abruptly shifted in her direction. Her older sister Maria Josefa, who had been promised in marriage to King Ferdinand of Naples, died of smallpox shortly before the wedding. The marriage was renegotiated. Maria Carolina was sent to Naples instead, in Maria Josefa's place. The dominoes shifted down the line, and suddenly Maria Antonia, who had not been intended for any high-prestige match, was being eyed as the eventual bride for the most important prince in Europe outside the Habsburg family itself, the Dauphin of France, the grandson and heir of Louis XV, the future king of the great enemy, and now, after the diplomatic revolution of 1756, the great ally of the Habsburg crown. That diplomatic revolution, by the way, deserves a paragraph of its own, because the marriage that ended Marie Antoinette's life can only be understood as the consequence of a piece of statesmanship that occurred when she was a baby. For most of the 17th and early 18th centuries, France and Austria had been hereditary enemies. They had fought wars against each other in every generation. The whole structure of European diplomacy was organized around their rivalry. Then, in 1756, a Habsburg minister named Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz, working with Maria Theresa's full support, engineered an extraordinary reversal. He persuaded the French foreign ministry that the real threat to both France and Austria was now Prussia, a state that had risen rapidly under Frederick the Great, and that had embarrassed both powers in the previous generation. France and Austria signed a defensive alliance. The two great enemies of the previous century became, almost overnight, official partners. The diplomatic revolution, the renversement des alliances, was complete. Like most political alliances of this era, the new arrangement needed to be sealed by marriage. The original plan was that one of Maria Theresa's older daughters would marry into the French royal family. The deaths and reshuffling in the late 1760s pushed the arrangement down to her youngest available daughter. By 1768, when Maria Antonia was 12, the choice had effectively been made. She would be the bride. She would be the seal. The problem was that the time was very short, and the inadequacies were very real. Her education was thin. Her French, the language she would need to live in every day for the rest of her life, was uneven. Her teeth famously were crooked. Her hairline was, by the assessment of the French observers who reported back from Vienna, too low for the elaborate headdresses that French court fashion would require. The Abbé de Vermond, a French priest with experience in royal tutoring, was sent from Paris to Vienna in 1769 specifically to take over her education in the run-up to the marriage. He was a kind man and a competent one, and he had real affection for his pupil. He also, in his confidential reports back to Versailles, did not pretend that the situation was promising. He found her intellectually quick but profoundly distractible. He could engage her in conversation about almost any topic, and she would respond brightly and often perceptively. He could not, by any pedagogical strategy he attempted, get her to sustain attention long enough to learn anything in depth. He wrote, with the resignation of a teacher who has accepted that his pupil is capable of more than she will deliver, that she had a great deal of native intelligence which she did not always use. A French dentist, Pierre Laveran, was brought to Vienna to address the teeth. The procedure he employed, which used a primitive form of orthodontic appliance, was applied for several months and produced a noticeable improvement. The hairdresser Larsener was brought in to restyle her hair and to manage the cosmetic adjustments to her hairline that the French court would notice. Portrait painters were commissioned to produce images of her in the French style and send them to Versailles for approval. Letters from the French ambassador in Vienna, the Marquis de Durfort, kept the Versailles court informed about her progress. The whole apparatus of dynastic preparation hummed in the background of her last year and a half in Vienna, and she felt all of it, although her letters from this period suggest that she felt it more as a series of demands than as a single coherent project. In April of 1770, the proxy marriage was performed. This was a procedure that had been used for centuries in dynastic marriages where the bride and groom were in different countries. A male relative of the bride stood in for the absent groom. The marriage vows were exchanged in front of the appropriate witnesses, and the union became, for legal and ecclesiastical purposes, valid. The proxy in this case was Maria Antonia's brother Ferdinand. The ceremony took place in the Augustinian church in Vienna on April 19, 1770. From that moment, she was technically married to Louis-Auguste, the Dauphin of France. She had still never met him. Then began the journey. The procession that left Vienna in the last week of April 1770 was, by the standards of the era, enormous. 57 carriages, more than 100 mounted attendants, servants, ladies-in-waiting, priests, doctors, secretaries, kitchen staff, 376 horses, replaced at relays along the route. The total cost of the journey, paid by the Habsburg treasury and partially reimbursed by the French, ran into hundreds of thousands of livres. The procession moved at the dignified pace of a state event, perhaps 20 to 30 miles a day, stopping each night at some monastery or noble residence prepared in advance to receive it. The young Archduchess herself was at the centre of this slow-moving spectacle in a carriage upholstered in red velvet, trying to keep up with the schedule of formal receptions and presentations that filled each day. Her mother had given her, in the days before her departure, a series of detailed instructions. Maria Theresa was an inveterate writer of instructions. She had drafted by hand a regulation of conduct that her daughter was to read every month for the rest of her life, covering everything from the daily reading of religious texts to the proper way to receive ambassadors. She had also written a long personal letter, more emotional than the formal regulation, expressing her love and her anxiety and her hopes. The letter, like the regulation, would travel with Marie Antoinette over the Rhine in the trunk that was supposed to be left behind, and which she somehow contrived to keep. There are surviving letters between Maria Theresa and her daughter from the years that followed, which suggest that the mother continued to issue these instructions in writing, monthly or more often, for the rest of her life, and that the daughter did her best to receive them with the appropriate gratitude even when she was by then Queen of France in her own right. The instructions were not gentle. Maria Theresa loved her daughter in a way that involved very little softness in her public expression of it. The letters, even the ones she wrote in her last years, are full of anxious warnings, sharp criticisms, demands for better behaviour, lists of mistakes that had been reported back to Vienna by the Austrian ambassador to France. Marie Antoinette read them and replied to them with what is generally a remarkable patience, although her replies sometimes contain a flash of resistance, a phrase indicating that she has heard her mother and that she will do as she is asked, but that she also has her own opinions and her own life. Those flashes are rare. The mother's authority, even at a distance of hundreds of miles, was not something her daughter ever quite escaped. So that is the procession that arrived at Strasbourg on May 7th, 1770. A girl in a velvet carriage surrounded by an extraordinary apparatus of state, travelling toward an island in the Rhine where she would be required to leave everything Austrian behind. Her mother's letters were in her trunk. Her mother's instructions were in her head. Her mother's expectations were what she was about to be tested against every day for the rest of her life. The handover ceremony itself, when it came, was painful. She arrived at the wooden pavilion in the morning. She passed through the Austrian anteroom where her ladies-in-waiting helped her undress. Her clothes were placed in a separate room. She walked, shivering, into the central chamber. The witnesses were assembled. The official handover protocol was read aloud. She was inspected in the formal sense to confirm her identity, and then she was passed across to the French delegation, who clothed her in French silks that had been prepared in the French anteroom. She emerged in the new clothes. She was now, officially, Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France. It is reported that she wept during the ceremony. The delegations on both sides did their best to reassure her. The senior French representative, the Comtesse de Noailles, who would become her chief lady-in-waiting and who would also become, in her stiffness and her ferocious attachment to protocol, one of the more difficult figures in her early life at Versailles, attempted to be kind. But the moment was, by every account, hard. Her dog, a pug named Mops, had been left behind in the Austrian anteroom. Her childhood companions, the women who had grown up with her and who had been her closest friends, had been left behind. The letters from her mother, which she had kept in the trunk despite the protocol, were now hidden in the lining of a sleeve. She walked around the floor of the wooden pavilion and out into a country she had never seen before, in clothes that were not hers, with a name that had been changed. The procession continued from the island on the French side, and the welcoming ceremonies began. She passed through Strasbourg, where the bishop greeted her. She was driven through cheering crowds in city after city, as she made her way slowly toward Compiègne, where the French royal family was waiting to meet her in person for the first time. The journey from the Rhine to Compiègne took several days. By the time she arrived on May 14, 1770, she had been on the move for almost 3 weeks and was visibly exhausted, although she had been trained sufficiently well in the management of public appearances that the exhaustion did not show in any way that the chroniclers were able to record. 2 days after the handover, on May 14, 1770, she met her future husband for the first time. His name was Louis-Auguste, Duc de Berry, the Dauphin of France. He was 15 years old. He was tall, awkward, nearsighted, and physically unimpressive. He was passionate about hunting and about locks. He could spend hours in his private workshop disassembling and reassembling intricate mechanical locks, an activity that he found genuinely calming and that the rest of the court found, frankly, embarrassing. He was shy to the point of social paralysis. He read history books. He cared about geography. He was, by every account, a kind young man with a fundamentally decent disposition who was completely unsuited to the role of king and was somewhat aware of this himself. He would in fact become a moderately competent king, not a great one, but not the disaster that the popular image of Louis XVI sometimes suggests. He read his ministerial reports. He cared about reform. He genuinely wanted to do the right thing. He was simply not built for a form of crisis that was about to engulf his country, and he knew it, and the knowing made him slower to act when speed was the only thing that might have saved him, he was also profoundly inhibited around women, an inhibition that had probably been worsened by the deaths of his parents when he was 11 and 12. He had been raised by a series of competent but emotionally distant tutors. He had been told, repeatedly, that he was not as impressive as his older brother, who had died young, and who was remembered, in the family mythology, as the brilliant prince he himself was failing to be. He believed it. That is the boy who met Marie Antoinette at Compiègne on May 14, 1770. The official greetings were exchanged in the proper form. He was reported to have looked at her without much visible reaction. She was reported to have curtsied and to have responded with the practiced charm she had been trained for. They were married 2 days later, on May 16th, in the chapel of Versailles, in front of the entire court, and a personal letter from Maria Theresa that Marie Antoinette would carry, folded, for the rest of her life. The wedding banquet was magnificent. The fireworks at Versailles afterwards were spoiled by a thunderstorm. The fireworks in Paris a few days later, on May 30th, ended in a real catastrophe when a panic in the crowd led to a stampede, in which somewhere between 100 and 200 people were trampled or crushed to death. The contemporaries who recorded the event noted, in the somewhat superstitious way of the era, that this was an inauspicious omen for the new marriage. The young bride and groom in Versailles were not told the full extent of the casualties for several days. They were both deeply distressed when they learned of it. Louis-Auguste, in a but genuine gesture of his character, sent his entire personal allowance for the year to be distributed to the families of the dead. And here we come to the strangest, most awkward, most diplomatically charged fact of the early years of their marriage. It was not consummated, not on the wedding night, not the next month, not the next year. Not, in fact, for somewhere between 7 and 7.5 years. I want to be with how I talk about this, because it became at the time an obsessive topic of European diplomatic correspondence and a subject of cruel and detailed pamphlet literature. Modern historians have argued back and forth about exactly what was happening. The most likely explanation, supported by contemporary medical observations and by the eventual successful resolution, is that the situation was a combination of physical awkwardness on Louis-Auguste's part and emotional intimidation in a marriage between two teenagers who barely knew each other and were being watched, scrutinized, and reported on by an entire kingdom. There may also have been a minor physical condition that was either resolved with time or, less probably, with a surgical intervention. Some historians dispute the surgery story. The evidence is genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is the diplomatic catastrophe this represented. A royal marriage in 18th century Europe had one fundamental purpose, which was to produce an heir. Till an heir was produced, the alliance the marriage represented was not secured. Until the heir was produced, Marie Antoinette's position at the French court was, in a certain technical sense, provisional. She was the wife of the Dauphin, and the longer it took, the more rumours there were, and the more pamphlets, more pressure her mother applied from Vienna in letter after letter. Maria Theresa wrote with the bluntness of an empress who did not have time for delicacy. She wanted to know what was being done. She wanted to know whether her daughter was making sufficient effort. She wanted, above all, to know when she could expect a grandchild who would secure the alliance she had spent decades constructing. The pressure from Vienna was conveyed not only through these direct letters, but through the Austrian ambassador to France, the Comte de Mercy-Argenteau, who became one of the central figures in Marie Antoinette's life during her early years at Versailles. Mercy Argenteau had a peculiar dual role. He was technically the representative of the Austrian crown in Paris, with all the formal duties that implied, but he was also, by Maria Theresa's instruction, his daughter's unofficial supervisor. He met regularly with the young Dauphine. He wrote detailed reports back to Vienna about her conduct, her friendships, her purchases, her conversations, her marital situation. He passed instructions from her mother. He attempted, with varying success, to steer her toward the political positions that the Habsburg court considered correct. He was, in essence, an embedded observer in her life, with a mandate from her mother to know everything she did. The fact that Marie Antoinette tolerated this arrangement says something about her relationship with her mother. The fact that she occasionally evaded it by withholding information from Mercy, or simply by lying to him about what she had been doing, says something about her relationship with her own life. In the spring of 1777, Maria Theresa sent her son Joseph II, by then co-ruler of the Habsburg lands, on a diplomatic mission to Versailles. The mission was officially about other matters, the Austrian position in the ongoing dispute over the Bavarian succession. Unofficially, it was about the marriage. Joseph spent time with his sister, brother-in-law, made his observations, and on his return to Vienna wrote a remarkable letter to one of his other brothers, a letter that historians have been picking apart for 2 centuries because it appears to address the marital problem in technical detail without quite naming what the problem actually is. He compared the situation to 2 clumsy people fumbling at something neither understood, and he expressed considerable frustration with both of them. He described his sister as good-hearted but lacking in seriousness, and his brother-in-law as well-meaning but inhibited and slow. Whatever advice he gave, in person, before he left, the situation began to resolve itself afterward. By the late summer of 1777, the marriage was consummated. By April 1778, Marie Antoinette was pregnant. Their first child was born in December 1778, a daughter. They named her Marie Theresa, after Marie Antoinette's mother, and she would be known at court as Madame Royale. The birth itself was an ordeal of a kind that I find genuinely difficult to describe without losing my temper, because the customs of Versailles required that the Queen give birth in public, not in private with her husband and her doctors, but in a room crowded with courtiers, all of whom had a traditional right to witness the delivery, in order to certify that no substitution of infants had taken place. This was not a symbolic crowd. By contemporary accounts, the room was so packed during Madame Royale's birth that the Queen briefly fainted from the heat and the lack of air, and several courtiers had to be physically removed before the windows could be opened. The next time she gave birth, the rules were quietly changed. But that first daughter was a beginning. After 8 years, the marriage had produced an heir to the Bourbon line. It was a daughter, not a son, which under French law meant the search for a male heir was not over. But it was, finally, evidence that the alliance was working as intended. In the years that followed, there would be 3 more pregnancies. A son, Louis Joseph, the Dauphin, in October 1781. Another son, Louis Charles, in March 1785. And a daughter, Sophie, in July 1786. Sophie would die at less than a year old. Louis Joseph would die at the age of 7, in June 1789. Louis Charles would die in 1795, at the age of 10, alone and ill, in the Temple prison. We will come to all of that. I am telling you now because the rest of the story is impossible to understand without holding the children in mind. Marie Antoinette was, among other things, a mother. The popular image of her as a frivolous queen, too distracted by parties to think about anything serious, is, among its other distortions, a profound misunderstanding of who she actually was once the children began to arrive. She loved them with a kind of intensity that surprised the court. She wanted, against all the conventions of royal child-rearing, to spend actual time with them, to nurse them when she could, to be the person they ran to. The court found this somewhat eccentric. She did not care. But before we get to the mother, I have to tell you about Versailles, because Versailles is where every other thing in this story takes place, and it is one of the strangest, most beautiful, most impossible buildings ever constructed by human beings, and you cannot understand any of what happens to her without understanding what it was like to live in it. Versailles was by 1770 almost 100 years old as a royal residence. Louis XIV had transformed it from his father's hunting lodge into the central performance space of European monarchy, and the basic premise of the place was that the king was always being looked at. Always. Every act of the royal day, every meal, every dressing, every undressing, every prayer, every walk in the gardens was a public event. The court lived around the king the way the planets in the old astronomical model orbited the Earth. He was the center, and the entire architecture of the palace and the entire choreography of the daily routine existed to make him visible. The palace itself was the largest royal residence in Europe. It contained, by some counts, more than 2,300 rooms. Approximately 10,000 people lived or worked within its walls and surrounding buildings on any given day. There were nobles in residence, who occupied apartments granted to them by the king as a privilege, often badly heated, always cramped, and frequently shared with multiple servants. There were ministers and government officials who maintained offices in the palace as part of the central administration of the state. There were servants of every grade, from the senior officers who managed the royal household down to the kitchen staff who prepared the king's meals at a remove that by the time the food arrived at the royal table, in short, it was almost always cold. There were also, perhaps strangest of all, ordinary visitors. Versailles was, in a real sense, open to the public. Anyone of even moderately respectable appearance could walk in. Tourists wandered the state apartments. Petitioners waited for hours in the antechambers in the hope of catching the king's eye. Pickpockets worked the corridors. Stray dogs trotted through the rooms. The palace was simultaneously the most formal building in Europe and one of the most populous, and the contradiction between those two facts produced an atmosphere that no contemporary description quite captures. It was crowded. It was theatrical. It was by modern standards very dirty. By the time Louis XV inherited this system in the early 18th century, it had become a kind of perpetual theatrical performance, sustained by an elaborate code of etiquette that governed everything from who could sit in whose presence to who could hand the queen her chemise in the morning. This last detail is not made up, by the way. There was a literal hierarchy of who had the right to hand the queen the first item of clothing she would put on each day, and the question of which woman performed that ceremony on a given morning was determined by the rank of every woman currently present in the room. If a higher-ranking woman entered while a lower-ranking one was already holding the chemise had to be passed up the ladder before it could be given to the queen. Marie Antoinette is recorded on at least one famously cold morning as having stood shivering while the chemise made its way through several pairs of hands before reaching her. She is reported to have said, quietly, that this was odious and ridiculous. She did not stop the ritual. She simply waited for it to finish, and then she put on her clothes. That single image, the Queen standing in her own bedroom waiting for permission to dress, captures something essential about what Versailles did to her. She had arrived from Vienna, where the Habsburg court was formal but rational, where her mother had simplified ceremonial whenever simplification was possible, where the royal family ate together in private and behaved, in many domestic moments, like a recognizable family. Versailles was nothing like that. Versailles was an institution that had been refined generation by generation into a perfect mechanism for surrounding the royal person with witnesses and procedure. The lever, the formal morning rising of the king or queen, was attended by selected courtiers in a strict order. The grand couvert, the public dinner, was attended by anyone of sufficient rank who wanted to come and watch the royal family eat. Strangers walked in. Tourists, in essence, watched her use a fork. The chief enforcer of this regime in her early years at Versailles was the Comtesse de Noailles, the senior lady-in-waiting who had received her at the handover ceremony on the Rhine. The Comtesse was a woman in her 50s who had spent her entire adult life at Versailles and who regarded the proper observance of court etiquette as something approaching a religious duty. She was, by all accounts, not unkind. She was simply incapable of imagining that the rules could ever, under any circumstances, be relaxed. Marie Antoinette gave her a private nickname which became famous later. She called her Madame Etiquette. The name was accurate. The Comtesse de Noailles existed in the young Dauphine's life, primarily as a corrective voice. Whenever Marie Antoinette did anything informal, anything spontaneous, anything that might be construed as departing from the script of the Versailles day, the Comtesse appeared to remind her, gently but inexorably, of how it should have been done. There is a story from this early period that I find revealing. One day in the gardens, Marie Antoinette stumbled and almost fell. A nobleman near her instinctively reached out and caught her arm to her. Court protocol forbade any commoner, and even most nobles, from physically touching the body of a member of the royal family without permission. The Comtesse, who had observed the incident, later took Marie Antoinette aside to inform her, with great seriousness, that the nobleman should not have been permitted to touch her. The young Dauphine pointed out, reasonably enough, that she would otherwise have fallen. The Comtesse acknowledged this, but did not retreat from her position. The protocol existed for reasons, she explained. To allow exceptions was to permit erosion. The conversation went on for some time. Marie Antoinette did not change her mind, but she did learn something durable from the exchange, which was that there was nothing she could do, no impulse she could follow, no informal gesture she could make that would not later be assessed for compliance with a code that almost no one outside the palace really understood. She did not adjust to it. Or rather, she adjusted to it the way a healthy young animal adjusts to a cage, which is to say, she found ways around it. She spent more and more time in private apartments. She formed an inner circle of women friends, the Princesse de Lamballe, and later the Duchesse de Polignac, around whom she could behave informally. She skipped court events when she could. She started attending public theatre and opera in Paris, not just the court performances, where she could be a face in a box rather than a person on a stage. She gave parties for her friends in her private rooms that excluded most of the court. The court noticed, and the court resented it. The royal family she had married into was, in itself, a world that I should describe before we go any further, because the relationships within it shaped a great deal of what happened to her. There were two surviving brothers of the king. The elder, the Comte de Provence, would eventually become Louis XVIII after the Bourbon Restoration of 1815. He was, by every account from contemporaries, intelligent in a cold and devious way, fond of literary pursuits, physically heavy, and deeply jealous of his older brother. He had hoped, before the consummation of his brother's marriage produced an heir, that he might himself eventually inherit the throne. The arrival of Marie Theresa, and then of the male heirs that followed, displaced him further from the succession with each birth, and he never entirely forgave the queen for her fertility. His own marriage, to a Savoyard princess named Marie Josephine, was unhappy and produced no children. He was not, in the early years, an enemy of his sister-in-law, but he was not really her friend either. When the revolution came, he would emigrate, work for years from various European courts to undermine the constitutional government, and outlive almost everyone in this story. The younger brother of the king, the Comte d'Artois, who would much later, briefly, reign as Charles X, was the opposite of his middle brother in temperament. He was charming, frivolous, athletic, fashionable, and politically reckless. He was closer in age and personality to Marie Antoinette than her own husband was. They danced together. They rode together. They appeared together at fashionable Paris venues that the more cautious members of the family avoided. Some of the early pamphlets attacking the Queen accused her of an affair with him, an accusation that almost no serious historian credits, but that captures something accurate about the visible warmth of their friendship. His own marriage, like his brother's, was politically arranged and not happy, although it did produce two surviving sons. When the revolution came, he was the first significant member of the family to emigrate, leaving France in July 1789, only days after the fall of the Bastille, and spending the next quarter-century among the most uncompromising of the émigré faction. The fact that her brother-in-law was, in the popular view, the leader of the émigrés actively conspiring against the revolution, did not help Marie Antoinette's situation, since she was inevitably suspected of being in correspondence with him, which she sometimes was. Behind the brothers, in the network of senior royal relatives, were the king's aunts, the unmarried sisters of his father. They were known collectively as Mesdames Tantes, and the most politically active of them was Madame Adelaide, the eldest of the surviving daughters of Louis XV. Madame Adelaide was a woman of strong conservative convictions and even stronger personal animosities. She had detested Madame Dubarry, on principle and on personality, and she had been one of the most active figures pressing the young Dauphine to refuse to speak to her in those early years. She had then, when Dubarry was banished by the new king after Louis XV's death, transferred her formidable energies to a long campaign of disapproval directed at almost every modernization or simplification the new queen attempted at court. The Mesdames Tantes were, in the Queen's life, a kind of ambient negative pressure, never quite hostile enough to be denounced openly, but never quite supportive enough to be relied on. They eventually emigrated to Italy in 1791 and died there during the early years of the Revolution. The senior cousin of the king and the wealthiest member of the extended royal family besides the king himself was Louis-Philippe Joseph, the Duc d'Orléans, who would later rename himself Philippe Eaglelight in support of the revolution, and would eventually vote for the death of his own cousin in January 1793. He was an intelligent, ambitious, deeply alienated man whose Paris residence at the Palais Royal was, throughout the 1780s, one of the principal centres of opposition political activity in France. The gardens of the Palais Royal, which he had developed commercially as a kind of public arcade lined with shops and cafes, were by the late 1780s the place in Paris where political pamphlets were freely sold, and where opposition figures could gather to plan against the crown. The Duc d'Orléans was, in some real sense, the financial sponsor of the early revolution. He was widely suspected of paying for some of the most damaging pamphlets attacking the Queen, and the suspicion, while never fully proven, was not without basis. The fact that the most dangerous of her enemies in the immediate family was her own husband's cousin, operating from a palace less than a mile from the Tuileries, is one of the more disturbing features of the late Ancien regime. He would himself be executed in November 1793, less than a month after his cousin Marie Antoinette, by the same revolutionary government he had spent years funding. There is a kind of irony in his fate that I will leave you to assess. The daily routine of life at Versailles, into which she fitted herself with varying degrees of compliance, was structured around the king's schedule. The Petit Lever, the king's first rising, was attended by a group of senior officers of the household and intimate family. The Grand Lever, later, was attended by a much larger group of nobles who had the formal right of entry. The king dressed in stages, with each item of clothing handed to him by an officer in an order. The Queen had her own parallel ceremonies, less elaborate, less attended. The royal mass was celebrated in the chapel each morning. The king worked in his cabinet through the late morning, meeting with ministers. The royal couple typically dined together in the late afternoon, sometimes in private, and sometimes in the famous public dining ceremony of the Grand Couvert. The evening was given over to court entertainments, card games, formal receptions, or in some cases simply hours in the family apartments. Bed came late, sometimes after midnight, and the next morning the cycle began again. This was, with seasonal variations and occasional travel, the rhythm of every day of her adult life until October 1789. Before we get to the friends, though, I want to tell you about Madame Dubarry, because the encounter between Marie Antoinette and Madame Dubarry is one of the small, vivid moments of her early years at Versailles, and it tells you something about her personality before she had quite learned what kind of person she was supposed to be. Madame Dubarry was the official mistress of the elderly King Louis XV. She had risen from extremely modest origins, had worked for a time in a fashionable Paris dress shop, and had been introduced to the king in 1768 through the offices of one of his courtiers. She was beautiful, she was charming, and she was politically inconvenient. The senior aristocracy of France regarded her as an embarrassment, a low-born interloper who had been forced into the royal household by the king's appetite. Maria Theresa in Vienna regarded her with horror. The general scandal of having the King of France carry on openly with a former courtesan was made worse, in Maria Theresa's view, by the fact that her own daughter was now living in the same palace and would, sooner or later, be expected to acknowledge the woman socially. The young Dauphine, taking her cues from her mother and from the senior conservative ladies of the court, refused to do so. She refused to speak to Madame Dubarry. Court etiquette required that the lower-ranking party in any encounter wait to be addressed before speaking, and so Marie Antoinette's silence had the effect of preventing any social interaction at all. This went on for more than a year. Louis XV was annoyed. Madame Dubarry was humiliated. The Austrian ambassador, Mercy Argenteau, urged the Dauphine to relent on the grounds that her stubbornness was endangering the alliance she was supposed to be cementing. Maria Theresa, contradicting her own instincts, eventually wrote to her daughter from Vienna, asking her to give in. On New Year's Day 1772, Marie Antoinette finally said something to Madame Dubarry. The exact words are recorded by several witnesses with variations. She said something like, "There are a great many people at Versailles today," a perfectly innocuous remark about the size of the New Year's reception. Madame Dubarry was satisfied. The king was satisfied. The protocol crisis was over. But what is interesting about the incident, in retrospect, is what it tells you about the young Dauphine. She had held out for over a year. She had endured pressure from her mother, from the ambassador, from the king himself. She had been miserably uncomfortable for most of that period. And in the end, the only words she could bring herself to say were the most general, most empty, least committal phrase she could possibly have produced. She had been forced to give in, but she had not given in any further than the absolute minimum required. Whatever else you can say about that, it was not the act of a politically pliable woman. It was the act of someone with a stubborn streak that her charming surface concealed. Louis XV, the elderly king under whose long reign Marie Antoinette had arrived in France, died in May 1774. The cause was smallpox, which he contracted from a young woman who had been brought to his apartments and who, neither he nor she realized, was already infected. The disease moved through him quickly. He was a man in his mid-60s, weakened by years of indulgence, and he had no real chance of survival. The last weeks of his life, in early May, were a public event of a kind that we would now find extraordinary. The court gathered. The royal family kept vigil. The protocols of dying, which at Versailles were as elaborate as the protocols of living, were observed in detail. He died on May 10th, 1774, just before 3 in the afternoon. The senior official of the household, by tradition, walked through the state apartments and announced the news in the formula that had been used at every royal death for centuries. The king is dead. Long live the king. Louis-Auguste, the awkward young prince who had married Marie Antoinette 4 years earlier, was now Louis XVI. He was 19. His wife was 18. They had been told earlier that day that the change was coming. The story that has come down from the moment is that, on hearing the formal announcement, they fell to their knees together and wept, and one of them, accounts differ on which, said something to the effect that they were too young to reign. The phrase has become famous. It may be embellished. It captures, even if the words were not exactly those, something true about what they felt. The new king and queen left Versailles immediately because the palace had to be cleansed of the smallpox infection. They went to the Château de Choisy, where the formal public mourning was managed and where the new reign began. Louis XVI's first significant act, which I find revealing, was to recall the parliaments, the regional law courts that his grandfather had suspended. It was a popular decision and, in retrospect, probably a mistake. It restored a centre of opposition to royal authority that would, 15 years later, contribute substantially to the crisis that destroyed the monarchy. But at the time, in May 1774, it appeared as an act of reform. The new king was widely reported to be different from his grandfather. He was virtuous, he was serious, he was committed to the welfare of his subjects. The country, which had grown weary of the old king's mistresses and his cynicism, was prepared to be hopeful about its new sovereigns. For the first year or two, that hopefulness held. The new royal couple were popular. The young queen in particular was the object of widespread enthusiasm. She was beautiful in a way that the elderly Louis XV had not been for decades. She danced well at court balls, she rode well in the hunts, she charmed ambassadors, and entertained foreign visitors with the practised grace she had been trained for since childhood. The pamphlets at this period are mostly sympathetic. The crowds in Paris cheered her when she went into the city to attend the opera. There is a memoir of the young writer who would become Marshal Marmont, who saw her at a court ball at Versailles in this period, and who described her appearance in terms that are close to worshipful. She was, by his account, the most graceful and the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and she carried herself with an effortlessness that he could not stop watching. The early reign was also, briefly, a moment of genuine reform. Louis XVI had inherited a government that needed serious work, and his first appointments suggested that he understood this. He brought in as his finance minister a man named Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, a respected administrator and economic theorist with strong Enlightenment credentials. Turgot believed in free markets, in the abolition of internal trade barriers, in the reform of the corvée, the system of forced labour that French peasants owed for the maintenance of roads. He believed, above all, that the French state could not continue to operate on the financial basis it had inherited, and that serious structural reform was the only alternative to eventual collapse. He was, in many ways, the most clear-sighted minister Louis XVI ever appointed. He was also, almost from the moment of his appointment, opposed by every interest at court that stood to lose from his reforms, which was most of them. He proposed to abolish the guilds, the medieval corporate structures that controlled access to most skilled trades, and the guilds opposed him. He proposed to allow the free trade of grain across provincial boundaries, and the regional grain merchants opposed him. He proposed to begin taxing privileged orders, and the privileged orders opposed him. By the spring of 1776, less than 2 years into the new reign, the political pressure against him had become unmanageable, and the king, who never had the temperament to fight political battles for unpopular reforms, dismissed him. Marie Antoinette, in this period, was not the principal force behind Turgot's dismissal, although the popular mythology has often blamed her. She had been distantly hostile to him on personal grounds. He had been a serious and somewhat austere man with no time for the social rituals of the court, and he had clashed with several of her friends over patronage matters. She had certainly been part of the chorus of voices urging the king to dismiss him, but the decision was the king's, and the principal reasons were political rather than personal. Turgot had attempted reforms that the structure of the French monarchy was, in the end, too weak to support. He could not have succeeded with any queen as his ally. The lesson of his dismissal, which Louis XVI did not fully absorb, was that the financial crisis of the French state could not be solved by ordinary administrative measures, and that any minister who tried to solve it by genuine structural reform would be destroyed by the interests he was attempting to reform. His successor, Jacques Necker, was a different kind of figure. Necker was a Genevan banker, a Protestant in a country that did not formally allow Protestants to hold senior office, a self-made man whose financial expertise was widely respected. He served as Director General of Finances from 1777 to 1781, technically not as the principal minister because his religion forbade it, but in practice as the central architect of French financial policy during the period of the American War. His approach was different from Turgot's. He did not attempt structural reform. He believed, instead, that the financial crisis could be managed through better accounting, more transparency, and aggressive borrowing. He published in 1781 a Compte rendu au roi, an open accounting of the state's finances, which was the first time in French history that the actual fiscal position of the government had been made public. It was the most read non-religious book in France in 1781. It also, by smoothing over certain details that an honest accounting would have disclosed, somewhat understated the depth of the actual fiscal problem. Necker was dismissed in 1781, when his demands for greater authority over royal expenditure became politically untenable. He would be recalled twice more, in 1788 and again in 1789, in increasingly desperate circumstances, but his return engagements would be too late to address the structural problems that his earlier tenure had largely deferred. In the years between Necker's first ministry and the convening of the Estates General, the French state limped through a series of finance ministers who attempted, in various ways, to manage a problem that none of them was given the political authority to solve. Charles Alexandre de Calonne, who took over in 1783 after the most catastrophic fiscal year the state had yet experienced, was the most ambitious of them. Calonne understood that the existing tax system, which exempted the nobility and the church from most of the burden, was not generating enough revenue to service the existing debt, let alone reduce it. He proposed in 1786 a comprehensive package of reforms that would have created a new universal land tax payable by all property owners regardless of social status. The proposal was a direct attack on the privileged orders. It was, in retrospect, almost certainly the only kind of reform that could have saved the monarchy. It was in 1787, when he submitted it to the Assembly of Notables for endorsement, comprehensively rejected. The Assembly of Notables, which Calonne had convened on the assumption that hand-picked senior figures would back his reforms, did the opposite. They demanded explanations. They demanded audits. They demanded that the king reduce his own expenditure before asking the propertied classes to pay more. They were, in effect, refusing to participate in the salvation of the state on the terms the state was offering. Calonne was dismissed. His successor, Loménie de Brienne, attempted to push the reforms through the parliaments, the regional law courts that had the right to register royal edicts. The parliaments refused. They demanded the convocation of the Estates General, the ancient representative assembly that had not met since 1614. By the autumn of 1788, the king had run out of options. He agreed to convene the Estates General. The meeting was scheduled for May 1789 at Versailles. Necker was recalled to manage the preparations. The most respected financial expert in Europe was being asked to oversee a process that, by the time he arrived, was effectively beyond saving. Throughout this entire decade, from the dismissal of Turgot in 1776 to the convocation of the Estates General in 1789, Marie Antoinette was being held responsible in the popular imagination for events whose actual causes she had at best a peripheral influence over. She had been in some periods an active participant in court factionalism that had undermined certain ministers. She had been in other periods more or less withdrawn from active political involvement. She had certainly been complicit in the system of patronage that drained the treasury for the benefit of her friends. But the great structural decisions, the decisions that determined whether reform was possible and what kind of reform might succeed, were made by the king and his ministers, and the Queen's role in those decisions was secondary at best. The popular conviction that she was the principal cause of the financial crisis was not, in the end, supported by the actual sequence of events. It was supported, instead, by a much older pattern in political culture, in which female figures at the top of unjust systems are blamed for the system's failures because the systems themselves are too large and too complicated to blame coherently. She was easier than the system. She was the part of the system you could put a face to. If she had been left alone in this period, if the early enthusiasm had been allowed to settle into a quieter long-term affection, the rest of her life might have been very different. She was not left alone. The court, which had at first welcomed her, began within a few years to take note of her habits and to talk about them. The pamphleteers who had been under the early reign began to find new material as the years passed. The financial crisis of the French state, which was already serious at the moment of her husband's accession, began to deepen, and the search for someone to blame for the crisis began to focus with increasing intensity on the young queen. But before any of that, in the first years of the reign, she was making certain decisions, mostly unconscious ones, that would shape what came afterward. She was assembling her inner circle. She was, in effect, choosing the people who would be most visible around her for the next decade, and the choices she made would prove, in the long run, very costly. The first of those friends, the one she had cared about most in the early years, was the Princess de Lamballe. Marie Therese Louise of Savoy-Carignan had been born in Turin in 1749, 6 years before Marie Antoinette. She had been married very young to a French prince, Louis Alexandre, the Prince de Lamballe, who had died of complications from a venereal disease less than a year into the marriage, leaving her a widow at 18. She had moved into French court society as a respectable young dowager and had become friendly with Marie Antoinette in the early 1770s. The two women were close in age, similar in temperament, and connected by a shared sense that the French court could be navigated more comfortably by a group of friends than by a single woman alone. The Princess de Lamballe was gentle, fragile, prone to faintness, deeply pious, and loyal in a way that would eventually cost her her life. Marie Antoinette appointed her, in 1774, to the senior household position of Surintendante de la Maison de la Reine, the highest-ranking woman in the Queen's establishment. The appointment was controversial. The position had been left vacant for decades because of its expense, and because of the difficulty of filling it without offending several other claimants. Marie Antoinette filled it on personal preference. The court noticed. The second of the close friends who would in time displace the Princess de Lamballe in the Queen's affections was Yolande de Polastron, who became Duchesse de Polignac through her marriage. She was introduced to Marie Antoinette in 1775. She was, by every account, charming, beautiful, easygoing, and skilled in a version of relaxed, witty conversation that the Queen found most refreshing. She was also poor by aristocratic standards, and her family was not distinguished. The friendship developed quickly. Within a few years, the Duchesse de Polignac was the Queen's most intimate companion, with daily access to her private apartments and the de facto authority to extend invitations to her informal evenings. Her family, the Polignacs, became an extended faction at court, with positions and pensions distributed to them by royal favour. The Duchess herself became governess of the children of France, the senior position in the royal nursery, when Marie Therese was born in 1778. The criticism of the Polignac influence, which would build through the 1780s and become one of the major themes of the pamphlet attacks on the Queen, was that the family was using its closeness to the Queen as a vehicle for unprecedented self-enrichment. There was some truth to this. The Polignacs received pensions, offices, and grants of land in amounts that were, even by the generous standards of French court patronage, conspicuous. The Duchess herself never asked for any of these directly, by all reliable accounts. Her relatives and connections did the asking for her, and the Queen, who loved the Duchess personally and trusted the family, granted what was requested. The result was a drain on the royal treasury that, in any other period, might have passed unnoticed, but that, in the financial conditions of the late 18th century, became a public scandal. The criticism that the Queen had become too closely associated with a single faction, and that the faction was draining the treasury for its own benefit, was not entirely fair, but it was not entirely wrong either. She had, in choosing her closest friends primarily on the basis of personal compatibility rather than political utility, opened a vulnerability that her enemies were now fully prepared to exploit. The court had thousands of people in it whose entire lives were organized around the calculation of who was in favor and who was out. The fact that a group of individuals had been declared by the Queen's preference to be permanently in favor was an enormous practical insult to all the others. Whatever they had done to deserve their proximity to her was by definition unfair to the courtiers who had not received the same access. This is a structural feature of any court system. It is more pronounced when the favourites cluster around a queen rather than a king, because the Queen's access to political patronage is more constrained, and therefore easier to caricature as personal rather than functional. Marie Antoinette had not invented these dynamics. She had simply, by being herself, inflamed them. Now combine all of this with the fashion, because fashion was the other arena in which she became, almost without intending to, a controversial figure. Her primary collaborator in fashion was a woman named Rose Bertin, who has a genuine claim to being the first celebrity fashion designer in modern history. Bertin had been born in 1747 in Picardy to a family of modest means. She had begun as an apprentice in a Paris dressmaker's shop in the 1760s and had risen, through a combination of talent and ambition, to her own establishment in the Rue Saint-Honoré, where her shop, called Au Grand Mogul, had become a fashionable destination for the female aristocracy of Paris. She was introduced to Marie Antoinette around 1774, shortly after the accession, by the Duchesse de Chartres. The two women, designer and queen, took to each other immediately. Within months, Bertin was visiting the Queen's private apartments at Versailles twice a week to consult on the wardrobe. The arrangement was unprecedented. Royal dressmakers had existed before, but they had been craftsmen who delivered finished garments according to specifications. Bertin was something different. She was a creative collaborator, a fashion advisor, a person whose opinions on style the Queen actively sought. The court, which had no category for a woman like her, did not know what to call the relationship, and was suspicious of it almost immediately. She was given an unofficial nickname, the Minister of Fashion, that captured the unease about her position. She was a commoner. She was being received by the Queen alone in the Queen's private rooms on a regular schedule. She was being granted a kind of intimacy and a kind of professional standing that no woman of her social class had ever previously been granted. The senior aristocratic women at court regarded this as a revolution within their world, and they did not approve. The clothes that Bertin and the Queen produced together were extraordinary by any standard. Wide skirts supported by structures called panniers that could measure several feet across at the hips, dresses requiring tens of yards of silk, shoes with elaborately embroidered slippers, and, above all, hats. The hats and hairstyles of the 1770s under Bertin's influence reached a kind of theatrical height that has, with some reason, become one of the most recognizable features of the era. The poof, in particular, was a hairstyle developed by the Queen's hairdresser, Leonard Orty, working in collaboration with Bertin. It involved building the hair up over a structure of horsehair pads or wireframes, sometimes to heights of several feet above the head, and then ornamenting the resulting tower with fabrics, flowers, feathers, jewels, or themed objects. There is a famous example, the Pouf à la Belle Poule, designed in 1778 to commemorate a French naval victory which incorporated a model ship balanced in the hair. There were other examples that incorporated landscapes, classical scenes, current political events, and personal motifs of various kinds. The wearer of such a hairstyle had to sit very still during its construction, which could take hours. She had to sleep carefully afterward to preserve the structure, sometimes for several days between dressings. She had to enter rooms cautiously in case the hair caught on a chandelier. The whole apparatus was by any practical measure ridiculous. It was also, by the aesthetic standards of its moment, the height of fashion, and the women who could afford it competed with one another to produce the most spectacular examples. Leonard the hairdresser deserves a moment of his own here, because his career is one of the strangest in the era. Born in southern France around 1751, he had come to Paris as a young man and had developed a reputation in the salons of the city. He was introduced to the Queen in the mid-1770s and, like Bertin, became a regular fixture at Versailles. He was eventually granted the unprecedented status of personal hairdresser to the Queen, with the right to enter her private apartments on his own schedule. He travelled with her, dressed her hair for state occasions, and accompanied her on her trips to Paris. He was paid extraordinarily well. He developed a public personality of his own, sometimes attending opera performances in his own carriage and being recognized by the audience. He was, in his way, the first of a profession that would become familiar in the 19th and 20th centuries, the celebrity stylist, whose connection to the famous client became part of the stylist's own fame. In Leonard's case, the connection would prove, in the long run, dangerous. He was deeply involved in the planning of the flight to Varennes in 1791, charged with carrying a critical message ahead of the royal party, and he later wrote memoirs of variable reliability about his time in the Queen's service. The memoirs are still in print. They are a useful, if not always trustworthy, glimpse into a kind of intimacy with the Queen that very few people of any class were permitted. Marie Antoinette did not invent the styles she popularized. She popularized them. She made them, through her position, into the visible language of French elite femininity. And here is what nobody seems to have fully understood at the time, including her. Every yard of silk, every feather in a poof, every diamond on a stomacher was being noticed, not just admired, noticed, by people who were calculating in the back of their minds what it cost, by pamphleteers who would, in time, calculate it out loud, by artisans whose own livelihoods depended on the textile industries she was indirectly subsidizing, but who would also be among the first to suffer when the public mood turned, by philosophers and economists who were beginning, in the new mood of the 1770s, to argue that conspicuous consumption at the top was a moral problem and not just an aesthetic one. The styles also changed during her queenship in ways that, somewhat counterintuitively, did not improve her reputation. By the early 1780s, her tastes had shifted towards simpler, more naturalistic dress. The wide panniers were laid aside, the towering hairstyles were reduced. White muslin dresses, modelled loosely on English country fashion, became her favoured daily wear. There is a portrait of her by the painter Elisabeth Vigée Lebrun, painted in 1783, that I want you to look up at some point if you have not seen it. It is called Marie Antoinette en Gaul. The Queen is shown in a simple white muslin dress, with no formal court trappings, her hair lightly powdered, holding a single rose. The dress is the character of thing that an English gentlewoman might have worn in her garden at the time. When the painting was first exhibited at the Salon in 1783, it caused a scandal. People were offended. They thought she had been painted in her underwear. They thought it was disrespectful for a Queen of France to be shown so informally. They also, simultaneously, used the painting as evidence that she was personally undermining the French silk industry by refusing to wear French silks and instead favouring lighter cottons imported from outside the country. The painting was withdrawn. Vigée Lebrun produced a second version showing her in a more conventional silk gown. The point I want to make about that incident is not that the public was unfair, which they probably were. The point is that whatever Marie Antoinette did, in fashion or in anything else, was now being read politically. She had become, by the early 1780s, a screen against which any complaint about the French court, the French monarchy, or the French economy could be projected. She wore too much silk, she was being extravagant. She gambled at cards in private with her friends. She was a fritterer of public funds. She stopped attending public events. She was contemptuous of the court. She attended public events. She was performative and shallow. Whatever she did was wrong. Whatever she did was used. This was happening even before the diamond necklace affair, which is the moment most historians point to as the formal collapse of her reputation. We will come to the necklace. But the ground had been prepared. The mood that allowed the necklace affair to be believed had been built, brick by brick, over the previous decade. There is one more dimension of her cultural life that I want to mention before we move on, because it tells you something about who she was as a person, and not just as a public figure. She was, throughout her adult life, a serious lover of music. Her education in Vienna had included instruction on the harpsichord and the harp, both of which she played well. She maintained the practice of both instruments at Versailles. She owned several harps. One of them, made for her by the great French maker John-Henri Nardman in the 1780s, is preserved in a museum collection today. She was a patron of the composer Christoph Willibald Gluck, who had been one of her music teachers in Vienna and who came to Paris partly through her influence. The reform of French opera that Gluck led in the 1770s, which produced some of the most enduring works of the era, was made possible in significant part by her patronage. She attended his premieres. She defended his work against the partisans of his Italian rival, Niccolò Piccini, in a fashionable and somewhat ridiculous controversy that divided Parisian opera-goers for several years. She loved music in a way that was not performative. She played for her own enjoyment. She attended performances for her own pleasure. The political pamphleteers, who attacked everything else about her, had little to say about her music, possibly because there was nothing to attack. It was one of the few areas of her life where her tastes were unimpeachable and her conduct was beyond criticism. It was also, for that reason, one of the few areas where she was permitted to be, in private, simply herself. Around the same time, in 1783 and the years that followed, she began to spend more and more of her time at a place called the Petit Trianon, And the Petit Trianon is, I think, the single physical space that best explains what was happening inside her by this point in her life. The Petit Trianon was a classical chateau in the gardens of Versailles. It had been built in the 1760s by the architect Anne-Jacques Gabriel for Louis XV, who had originally intended it as a private retreat for his official mistress at the time, Madame de Pompadour, although she died before it was finished. It had passed after her death to Madame Dubarry, who had used it during the last years of Louis XV's life. Louis XVI gave it to Marie Antoinette as a personal gift in 1774, shortly after his accession, with the famous words that the place had always been the residence of the favourites of the kings of France, and so it was right that it should now be hers. The remark is touching when you read it in context. It is also revealing about what he understood his marriage to be by that point. He was offering her something private, something hers, something that did not have to be public. She made it private. She made it hers. She made it, in a way that would prove fatal to her reputation, into a space from which she could exclude the court entirely. Only her closest friends were invited to the Petit Trianon. The rest of Versailles was kept out. The conventions of who could enter the king or queen's presence, which at the main palace were enforced by the intricate machinery of court etiquette, simply did not apply at the Trianon. She could see whom she liked. She could exclude whom she liked. She could, in effect, be the master of her own social circle for the first time in her adult life. Within its grounds she had built, beginning around 1783, what is now called the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's Hamlet, a miniature village. 12 rustic-style buildings around an artificial lake, including a working dairy, a watermill, a dovecote, and a thatched cottage decorated in its private interiors with extraordinary delicacy. The exteriors were designed to look weathered, deliberately aged, almost dilapidated, with painted cracks in the plaster and artfully arranged moss on the roofs. The interiors were furnished to a standard that any wealthy aristocrat would have considered adequate for a private residence. There were silk wall coverings, there were fine carpets, there were pieces of porcelain made specifically for the rooms. The contrast between the rough exterior and the polished interior was the entire point of the design. It was an aesthetic, a deliberate fantasy, an exercise in imagining oneself into a simpler life while keeping all the comforts of the actual life intact. The Queen and her closest friends would dress in simplified versions of country clothing, walk among the cottages, churn butter that had been prepared in advance by her servants, gather flowers from the gardens, and inhabit, for an afternoon, a fantasy of pastoral simplicity. There was a working farm. There was a flock of sheep, which by some accounts were occasionally washed and combed before the Queen visited. There were cows which produced milk that was poured into porcelain bowls that had been designed in the shape of breasts, an aesthetic conceit drawn from classical sculpture that the design team thought was clever and that would later be cited in the pamphlets as an example of the Queen's depravity. The whole apparatus was designed to allow her to play at being a countrywoman without having to be one. This was again used against her. The pamphleteers seized on the Hameau as a perfect example of royal absurdity. A queen pretending to be a milkmaid. A child playing with toys made of stone and timber while real peasants starved. The criticism is, frankly, partly fair. The Hameau was an enormous expense. It was a fantasy that could only be afforded by someone whose actual life was so far removed from rural poverty that rural poverty could be safely aestheticized. It was, in the language of a much later era, profoundly out of touch. But it was also, I think, something more than that. It was the act of a woman who had been performing a role in front of an audience for 15 years and who needed, occasionally, to stop. The hameau was where she could stop, where she could, briefly, be a person rather than a queen, where she could be alone with her children, or alone with her closest friends, or alone with a few books and the daily pleasures of an ordinary life. The fact that this required her to construct an elaborate stage set in order to access something most of her subjects had for free is, in a way, the perfect summary of her situation. She was so trapped inside the apparatus of monarchy that the only way she could simulate freedom was to build a model of a free person's life and step inside it for a few hours at a time. I do not think she fully understood, while she was building it, what it would look like later. I do not think any of us, in our daily acts of self-care, fully understand what they will look like when they are weaponized by people who have decided to hate us. The hameau was not the cause of her destruction, but it would in time become a useful symbol for it. She had also built, at the Petit Trianon, a private theatre. Theatre had been one of her great pleasures since she was a young woman, and at the Trianon she allowed herself to participate in performances rather than simply attend them. She and her friends, including occasionally the king's brother, the Comte d'Artois, would put on amateur productions of fashionable plays for an audience of invited intimates. She herself acted, she took roles, she rehearsed, she enjoyed it deeply. The performances were small. They were not generally remarked on outside her immediate circle, but they were for her a kind of release, a chance to perform a role she had chosen rather than the one she had been given, and to do it among people who would not assess her against an external standard of royal dignity. The performances continued on and off until 1786 or 1787, when the political situation began to make even private indulgences seem inadvisable. They were one of the things she gave up before she gave up everything else. Now we come to the diamond necklace affair, which is one of those genuinely strange episodes in the historical record where a single sequence of events happening to a single person who was almost entirely innocent of any wrongdoing in it somehow becomes the moment that changes everything. Napoleon, looking back on the period years later, is reported to have said that the Queen's death began with the diamond necklace affair. He may have been right. The story is long and tangled. Let me give you the essentials. There was a famous diamond necklace, originally commissioned by Louis XV for Madame Dubarry, that had never been delivered because the king died before he could pay for it. The necklace had been built over a period of years by the Parisian jewelers Charles-Auguste Béma and Paul Bassangy, who had assembled the diamonds for it from sources across Europe at enormous expense. It consisted of more than 600 diamonds in an elaborate setting and was worth in modern equivalent the sort of money that would build a village. The jewellers had made it on speculation, expecting the king to pay, and had been left with the finished piece on their hands when he died. They tried multiple times to interest Marie Antoinette. She refused. She thought it was vulgar. She thought the money would be better spent on a warship. She had no interest in owning it. The jewellers, who were now facing financial ruin because of the unpaid investment in the diamonds, became increasingly desperate over the years. They wrote letters, they arranged audiences, they reduced the price, they proposed payment in installments. None of it worked. By the early 1780s, the necklace was a commercial millstone around their necks. Then a woman named Jeanne de la Motte appeared. She had been born Jeanne de Saint-Remy de Valois, and her claim to nobility, although thin, was not quite fabricated. She could trace her descent from an illegitimate line of the Valois royal family that had ruled France before the Bourbons. She had grown up in poverty, had spent some years as a beggar, had eventually been recognized as having royal blood by a charitable benefactor and given a pension, and had married a minor cavalry officer who used the title of Count. She was, by every account, intelligent, ambitious, beautiful, and entirely unprincipled. She had spent the years before the necklace affair in a series of frauds, working her way through the lower fringes of court society in search of something larger. She found her opportunity in the form of Cardinal Louis-René de Rohan, a senior figure in the French church who had fallen out of favour with the Queen many years earlier and who was desperate to be restored to her good graces. Rohan was a man of enormous wealth, considerable vanity, and limited intelligence. He had served as French ambassador to Vienna in the early 1770s, where his conduct had offended Maria Theresa to the point that she had reported on him in highly negative terms in her letters to her daughter. By the time Rohan returned to France, the future queen had formed an impression of him that was unalterably hostile. Rohan, returning to court life, found himself frozen out by the queen's evident dislike. He believed that if he could only restore his position with her, his career and his social standing would be saved. He was, in essence, the perfect target for what Jeanne de la Motte was about to do to him. Jeanne convinced Rohan, over a series of carefully staged conversations, that she was on intimate terms with the Queen. She produced forged letters, supposedly from the Queen, which gradually became warmer in their language, and which Rohan, who was not a reader, accepted as genuine. She arranged a midnight meeting in the gardens of Versailles, at the Bosquet de Venus, between Rohan and a woman named Nicole Leguay d'Oliva, who had been hired and dressed for the occasion. The meeting was brief and dimly lit. The substitute queen handed Rohan a single rose and whispered a few words to the effect that the past was forgiven. Rohan, by his own account, was overjoyed. He came away convinced that he had been received in private by the Queen herself. Over the next several months, Jeanne built on this success. She convinced Rohan that the Queen wished to acquire the diamond necklace from Baymer and Bassenger, but did not wish her husband to know about the purchase, and that she therefore needed Rohan to act as her secret intermediary. The Cardinal, who would have done almost anything to maintain his supposed restored standing with her, agreed. He met with the jewellers. He negotiated terms on the Queen's behalf, with her consent as he believed. He took possession of the necklace on credit, signing for it on a document that Jeanne had supposedly endorsed with the Queen's signature. He then handed it over to Jeanne for delivery to the Queen. Jeanne, of course, did no such thing. She and her husband dismantled the necklace, sent the gems to London, and began selling them off across England and the Netherlands. The first instalment to the jewellers came due in the summer of 1785. The Cardinal could not produce the money. The jewellers, alarmed, wrote a letter to the Queen, asking politely about the delay and confirming the arrangement. The letter reached the Queen, who read it with bewilderment. She did not know what they were talking about. She had not bought any necklace. She had not authorized any purchase. The whole affair unravelled within days. Louis XVI, when the situation was explained to him, was furious. He had Cardinal Rohan arrested in front of the entire court at Versailles on a major holy day, in the middle of the Cardinal's official duties. Rohan was taken to the Bastille. Jeanne de la Motte was arrested shortly afterwards. The forgers and accomplices were hunted down. The trial that followed in 1786 was a public sensation across France and across Europe. The cardinal was acquitted by the Parliament of Paris. The acquittal was a deliberate political insult to the king and queen. The Parliament reasoned, in effect, that whatever Rohan had done, he had done in good faith and without intent to deceive, and that he could not be held responsible for having been duped by other people. Jeanne was convicted, branded with a hot iron on her shoulder, and imprisoned, although she would later escape and write memoirs from London accusing the Queen of every imaginable corruption. The jewellers were ruined. The crown was humiliated. But the deepest damage was something the trial itself did not produce, and it was this. The French public, on hearing the story, very largely believed that Marie Antoinette must have been involved somehow. They believed it because it fit. It fit the picture of her they had been building from the pamphlets and the gossip and the resentments of the previous 15 years. A queen who would commission a vulgar diamond necklace through a corrupt cardinal in a midnight garden meeting was already, in the public imagination, a plausible figure. The fact that she had not, in this case, done any of those things did not register. The story was the story. The trial had aired it, and the airing had made it real. She was completely innocent. She is one of the very few major figures in any historical scandal of whom that can be said with this level of confidence. Every relevant document supports it. Every credible witness supports it. She did not arrange the meeting. She did not write the letters. She did not commission the necklace. She was the victim of an elaborate fraud perpetrated by other people in her name. And it did not matter. The damage to her reputation was permanent. From 1786 onward, the pamphlets about her became more vicious, more obscene, more directly seditious. The phrase Madame Deficit, the Lady Deficit, attached itself to her in popular speech. By the late 1780s, she was in the public imagination no longer just a frivolous queen. She was a national problem. Now let me say something about the pamphlets themselves, because they are a real and ugly part of this story, and I do not want to gloss over them. From the early 1780s onward, an enormous quantity of underground literature was produced and circulated in France attacking the Queen personally. Some of it was political satire. Much of it was crude personal abuse. A significant proportion of it accused her of every kind of sexual misconduct that pamphleteers could imagine, with both men and women, with members of the royal family, with foreign ambassadors, with anyone whose name could be used to embarrass her further. None of this material had any factual basis worth discussing. Most of it was openly invented, but it was widely read. It shaped opinion. By the time of the Revolution, it had created in the French public mind a version of the Queen that bore almost no relationship to the actual person, but that the actual person could not, by any means available to her, correct. The volume of this material was extraordinary. Modern historians who have surveyed the surviving pamphlets, broadsides, and underground books from the period 1780 to 1793 have catalogued hundreds of separate publications attacking the Queen specifically, in addition to the many that attacked the monarchy in general. The works circulated through a black market in printed material that operated along the borders of France, Holland, Switzerland, and the German states. Many of the most virulent texts were produced abroad and smuggled in. Some were funded, almost certainly, by political enemies of the king and queen at court. The Duc d'Orléans, the king's cousin and the wealthiest member of the royal family after the king himself, was widely suspected of underwriting some of the attacks, although the evidence for his direct involvement is limited. Whether he financed them or simply benefited from them, the fact remains that he was the principal beneficiary of the Queen's destruction in domestic political terms, and his hands are not clean. This is one of the cruelest aspects of her story. She lived in an era before modern press laws, before any meaningful concept of defamation as it applied to political figures, before there was any way for someone in her position to push back against material being published about them. She knew the pamphlets existed. She read some of them. She found them extremely upsetting and was advised repeatedly to ignore them, because responding to them would only amplify them. She did her best to ignore them. They went on being printed. They went on being read. To understand what happened in the late 1780s, you need to know something about the financial and political crisis that was unfolding in France in those years, because it provides the context within which the Queen's growing unpopularity was being read. Let me give you the essential outline. The French state had been spending more than it took in for most of the 18th century. The wars of Louis XIV had left a substantial debt. The wars of Louis XV had not reduced it. The American War of Independence, which France had supported financially and militarily on the side of the American colonists from 1778 to 1783, had been by far the most expensive of these wars. The French expenditure on the American conflict, which produced the satisfying outcome of seeing the British defeated, but produced no direct financial return for France, had effectively bankrupted the state. By the mid-1780s, the French government was paying half its annual revenue in interest on its existing debt and was unable to balance its budget by any conventional means. A succession of finance ministers attempted to address the problem. Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, who had served briefly under Louis XV and continued under Louis XVI, had attempted reform along free market lines and had been dismissed in 1776 when his policies offended too many influential interests. Jacques Necker, a Swiss banker who had served as Director General of Finances from 1777 to 1781, had financed the American war through borrowing rather than taxation, partly to avoid the political opposition that new taxes would have provoked, and had been dismissed when his methods became untenable. Charles Alexandre de Calonne had taken over in 1783, and had pursued a policy of further borrowing combined with proposed structural reforms, including a new universal land tax that would, for the first time in centuries, have applied to the lands of the nobility and the church. This proposal was politically explosive. In 1787, Calonne convened an assembly of notables, a hand-picked gathering of senior nobles and clerics, and put his reform proposals to them. He hoped that they would endorse the reforms and lend their authority to the policy. They did the opposite. They rejected the proposals, demanded an explanation of how the financial situation had become so dire, and effectively refused to cooperate. Calonne was dismissed. His successor, Etienne Charles de Loménie de Brienne, attempted to push the reforms through anyway and was blocked by the parliaments, the regional law courts that had been recalled by Louis XVI at the start of his reign. By 1788, the king and his ministers had run out of options. The parliaments were demanding the convocation of the Estates General, the ancient representative assembly of the three estates of France, which had not met since 1614. The Estates General was, in effect, a national emergency procedure. It had no fixed procedural rules in modern terms. Its powers were uncertain, It had not met for 174 years. Convening it was, simultaneously, an admission by the Crown that ordinary methods had failed, and a gamble that the Assembly, once convened, would cooperate in a solution. The decision to convene was taken in 1788, with the meeting scheduled for May 1789 at Versailles. Necker, who had been recalled to the finance ministry, and who was the only minister with significant popularity outside the court, was given responsibility for managing the preparations. Throughout this period, the Queen was being held responsible for the financial crisis in the popular imagination. The pamphlets attributed the deficit specifically to her extravagance. The phrase Madame Deficit, which had emerged shortly after the diamond necklace affair, became the standard way of referring to her in seditious literature. The actual financial reality was very different. Her personal expenditure, while substantial, was a tiny fraction of total state spending. The major expenses of the French state were the army, the navy, the royal household considered as a whole, the diplomatic service, and the interest on the debt. Her dresses and her parties and her gambling were rounding errors in comparison. But this was not what the public believed, and its pamphleteers said. By 1788, in the imagination of a substantial portion of the French population, the Queen was the cause of the financial crisis. Removing her in some way would resolve it. The Estates General opened at Versailles on May 5, 1789. The procession through the streets the day before, on May 4th, had been one of the great public events of the late Ancien regime, with the deputies of the three estates, the King, the Queen, and the senior court, walking in formation through cheering crowds. The crowds, by all reports, cheered the King. They were silent, or worse, when the Queen passed. She had registered this. She had wept that night. The political dynamics within the Estates General itself were complicated and have been the subject of enormous historiographical attention. The essential point for our purposes is that the Third Estate, the representatives of the commoners, who outnumbered the other two estates combined, refused to be governed by the traditional voting procedures that would have given the privileged orders an effective veto. After several weeks of deadlock, on June 17, 1789, they declared themselves the National Assembly. 3 days later, on June 20th, locked out of their meeting hall by the King's officials, they assembled in an indoor tennis court and swore an oath, the tennis court oath, not to disband until they had given France a constitution. In the precise weeks during which all of this was happening, Marie Antoinette's first son, the Dauphin Louis-Joseph, was dying. I want to down here because I think the death of the Dauphin is the part of her life that the popular image most consistently misses, and because what happens with the Dauphin is, in its own way, the heart of the story. Louis-Joseph had been born in October 1781. He had been a strong, healthy, appealing child for the first several years of his life. He was the long-awaited son of the King and Queen, the heir to the Bourbon throne, the future of the dynasty. His birth had been celebrated across France with public festivals, fireworks, the firing of cannon, the ringing of church bells. The Queen had at last produced a son. The alliance had at last been fully sealed. But by 1788, when he was 6 years old, the Dauphin had begun to show signs of serious illness. His back curved. He grew progressively weaker. He could not run with the other children. By the spring of 1789, when the Estates General was being convened, he was unable to walk and had to be carried. The condition, which the physicians of the day did not have the diagnostic tools to identify precisely, was almost certainly a form of skeletal tuberculosis, a disease that destroys the bones and joints from within. There was no treatment for it in 1789. There would not be a treatment for it for another 150 years. His parents had moved him to the chateau of Meudon, on the outskirts of Versailles, hoping that the country air would help. It did not help. The Queen visited him constantly, sometimes spending entire days at Meudon and returning to Versailles late at night. She was, by every account from the period, in a state of profound distress. The political situation was developing around her at terrifying speed. Her son was dying. She had no ability to address either of these realities and was attempting, with what was left of her energy, to sustain both her duties and her grief. He died on the night of June 4th, 1789. He was 7 years old. I want you to hold the date in your head for a second. June 4th, 1789. 6 weeks earlier, on May 5th, the Estates General had opened. 2 weeks after the Dauphin's death, on June 17th, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly. 3 days after that, on June 20th, came the tennis court oath. Less than 6 weeks after the death of the Dauphin, on July 14th, 1789, the Bastille would fall. Think about what that meant for her. She lost her 7-year-old son in the precise weeks during which the political earth was opening under the entire monarchy. The personal catastrophe and the political catastrophe were happening simultaneously. There was no space to grieve. There was no time. The country needed a king and a queen. She got up every morning and was a queen. There is a detail from this period that I find unbearable, and I will tell you it briefly. At one point in the days immediately after Louis Joseph's death, a delegation from the Third Estate arrived at Versailles to meet with the king on urgent matters of state. The king received them. They began their business. They did not, by the conventions of the moment, offer any condolences, because they were there on official business, not personal. The king sent a note to his wife afterward, saying, with the shape of grief that has no language for itself, that they had not even mentioned the Dauphin. They had not mentioned that the king had just buried his son. They had simply gotten on with the demands of revolution. She wrote later that she felt, in those weeks, as if her child had been taken from her twice. Once by the illness, and once by the political moment that had not allowed his death to register as a death. The second son, Louis Charles, who had been born in 1785, now became the Dauphin. He was 4 years old. The political crisis through July and August 1789 moved at a speed that the king and his ministers could not match. The Bastille fell on July 14th. The king's authority over Paris collapsed almost immediately. The National Assembly, sitting at Versailles, was producing legislation that was abolishing, in successive sessions, the entire structure of feudal privileges that the French monarchy had been built on for centuries. On the night of August 4th, in a session that became famous later, the deputies voted away the last remaining feudal dues, the seigneurial rights, the tax exemptions of the nobility and the church, and 100 other inherited features of the old order. Within months, the structure of French society had been formally rewritten. In October 1789, 3 months after the fall of the Bastille, a crowd of Parisian women, exhausted by bread shortages and inflamed by political pamphleteers, marched to Versailles. They were joined along the way by sympathetic National Guardsmen and other men of the city. They arrived at the palace late in the afternoon of October 5th. They demanded bread. They demanded that the king and queen accompany them back to Paris. Through the night, the situation deteriorated. In the early hours of October 6th, members of the crowd broke into the palace. They reached the queen's apartments. She was warned just in time and ran, in her nightclothes, through the connecting corridors of Versailles to the king's rooms. 2 of her guards were killed in the commotion, their heads later carried through the streets on pikes. By the morning, the situation had been pulled back from total violence by the intervention of the Marquis de Lafayette, by then the commander of the new National Guard, but the terms of the day had been set. The royal family would return to Paris immediately with the crowd. They would not be returning to Versailles. They never did return to Versailles. The day they left, October 6, 1789, was the last day Marie Antoinette ever spent in the palace where she had lived since she was 14. The journey from Versailles to Paris took most of the day. The crowd surrounding the royal carriages was enormous, sometimes celebratory, sometimes hostile. Some of the women carried loaves of bread on the points of their pikes. Some of the men carried the heads of the dead guards. The royal family arrived at the Tuileries Palace in central Paris in the evening, exhausted, frightened, and with very little understanding of what was about to happen to them. The Tuileries had not been used as a royal residence for over 100 years. It was cold, ill-furnished, and partially derelict. The royal family was given the principal apartments, which were rapidly made habitable. The atmosphere of the place was completely different from Versailles. There were no gardens to walk in privately, no hameau to retreat to, no Trianon to escape to. The family was, in effect, in the middle of the city, surrounded by an urban population that was frequently hostile and that could appear at the gates in large numbers at almost any hour. The children, in particular, suffered from the change. At Versailles, they had had the run of the gardens, of the Trianon estate, of the spaces that had been arranged for them in the layout of the palace. They had had pets, ponies, gardens of their own where they had been encouraged to grow vegetables. The new Dauphin Louis Charles had been given a plot at the Trianon, where he had grown lettuces and radishes, and where he had been very proud of his harvests, which he had presented to his mother in baskets that were probably more valuable than the produce in them. All of that, after October 1789, was gone. The children at the Tuileries had an enclosed terrace where they could play under guard, and the public gardens of the Tuileries themselves where they could occasionally be taken under supervision. They had each other, and their parents, and a few attendants. The world they had been used to had been removed in a single afternoon and replaced with something much smaller and much greyer. The Queen tried in those Tuileries years to maintain something like a normal childhood for the children inside the constraints of their new circumstances. She read to them. She supervised their lessons. She continued, when permitted, to take them on outings within Paris. She took Louis Charles, who would become her closest emotional companion from that era, to see things in the city, to visit shops, to meet ordinary people whom she introduced to him as her friends. The boy was bright and affectionate, and absorbed everything around him with the open curiosity of a child who has not yet learned which observations are politically dangerous. He once asked, in front of guards, why the people in the street looked sad, and the Queen had to navigate the question with the sort of tact that mothers in difficult circumstances learn quickly. She did not lie to him. It was in many ways the most important thing she taught him in his short life. The lessons were absorbed. The boy who would die in the Temple in 1795 had, by the accounts of those who saw him in his last months, retained an unexpected gentleness through everything that had been done to him. Where it came from is not difficult to guess. Marie Theresa, the older child, was already showing the gravity that would mark her long later life. She was at an age between 11 and 13 during the Tuileries years, where she could understand most of what was happening. She read the political situation. She heard her parents' conversations in the moments when they thought she was asleep. She knew that her family was in danger. She did not, by every account from the period, complain of any of it. She seems to have decided, at some point in those years, that her role in the family was to be the one. She was steady. She remained so for the rest of her life. The seriousness that the revolution carved into her face during those years would never lift. There is a portrait of her made in her 70s by a painter at the court of one of the last Bourbon claimants, and the face in the portrait is recognizably the same face as the face of the 11-year-old girl who entered the Tuileries in October 1789. The revolution had reached down and made her old in advance, and she had grown into the age it had given her, and she had carried it for 60 years afterward. The next 2 years, from October 1789 to June 1791, were a period of constitutional negotiation, growing political pressure, and erosion of royal authority. The National Assembly produced, over many months, the Constitution of 1791, which transformed France into a constitutional monarchy with the king as head of state, but with most actual power vested in an elected legislature. The king, after much hesitation, accepted the constitution in September 1791 and swore an oath to uphold it. Whether he intended to abide by his oath in good faith is one of the most debated questions of its time. Most historians today believe that he did not, that he saw the Constitution as a temporary expedient that could be reversed when circumstances allowed, and that he was actively in correspondence with foreign monarchs about the prospect of military intervention to restore him to his old powers. The Queen was certainly involved in this correspondence. She was, in fact, frequently the more active correspondent, writing letters in invisible ink and using complex codes to communicate with her brother, the Holy Roman Emperor, and with other supportive courts. The chief organizer of this clandestine effort was a Swedish nobleman named Count Axel von Fersen. He had first met Marie Antoinette at a masked ball in Paris in 1774, when both of them were teenagers, and had renewed the acquaintance several times in the years that followed. He had served as a colonel in the French forces during the American War. By the late 1780s, he was a frequent presence at Versailles and a close friend of the Queen. The exact nature of their relationship has been debated by historians for 2 centuries. They wrote each other long letters, some of which have survived in damaged form, with key passages deliberately blacked out by Fersen's heirs in the 19th century to preserve the Queen's reputation. Modern scientific analysis of some of these letters has begun to recover the obliterated passages, and the recovered words suggest a relationship that was, at minimum, deeply emotionally intimate. Whether it was physically intimate is something we cannot say with certainty. What is certain is that Fersen was one of the most important people in her adult life, that she trusted him as she trusted no one else outside her immediate family, and that he, more than any other figure, was the person who attempted to organize her escape from the increasingly hopeless political situation. The plan for the escape, which became known to history as the flight to Varennes, was developed throughout the late winter and spring of 1791. The royal family would leave the Tuileries in the middle of the night, disguised as the household of a fictional Russian baroness, travel by carriage to the eastern frontier, and join with loyal French troops at the fortress of Montmedy under the command of the Marquis de Bouille. From there, they would issue a public declaration setting out the king's true position, attempt to negotiate with the National Assembly from a position of military strength, and, if necessary, draw on foreign support to restore the king's authority. The plan failed for a series of small, stupid reasons. The carriage Fersen had organised, a large Berlin custom built for the journey, was an extraordinary vehicle in itself, 6-wheeled, dark green and yellow, with white wheels and red leather upholstery. It had been designed for comfort over the long distances of European travel, with a folding table for meals, compartments for documents, fittings for chamber pots, even a wine cellar. It was also, fatally, much heavier than the ordinary post carriages that French roads were used to. It required 6 horses rather than the normal 4, and at every relay station the change of horses took longer than a normal change. It moved slowly, it attracted attention. The whole apparatus had been constructed for a level of comfort that the speed of the journey could not afford. Fersen himself had insisted on the comfort, and the king had not overruled him. The departure was delayed by several hours because of last-minute confusions in the household. The royal party left late at night on June 20th, 1791. The disguises were thin and easily seen through. The king, dressed as a valet for the supposed Russian baroness, was a man whose face had appeared on every coin in France for 16 years. The queen, dressed as a governess, had been one of the most painted women in Europe for 2 decades. The disguises depended on the assumption that no one would look closely. People did look closely. The king kept lifting his head out of the carriage window to watch the countryside, despite repeated warnings not to. He was at heart a man interested in geography, and the journey was the longest he had taken outside Versailles in years. He could not stop himself from looking. At a post station called Sainte-Ménehould, in the late afternoon of June 21st, a local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet was on duty. Drouet was a former soldier, a committed Republican, and a man with the kind of visual memory that political activists develop for the faces of their enemies. He saw the king's face through the carriage window. He compared it to the profile on a 50-livre assignat note in his pocket. He hesitated. The carriage moved on. He watched it pass through his town, and then, a few minutes later, he saddled a horse and rode hard along the back roads to the next significant town on the route, which was Varennes. Varennes itself is a place. It has not grown much since 1791, and you can still walk the streets the royal family entered that night. Drouet arrived ahead of the carriage, gathered a group of local National Guardsmen, and arranged for the road to be blocked. When the berlin arrived, sometime around 11 o'clock at night, it was stopped. The local mayor, a man named Sauce, who was a grocer in civilian life, examined the papers presented by the supposed Russian baroness. He was not entirely convinced, but he was reluctant to make a scene. He invited the party into his house above his shop while the matter was clarified. The king, in the upstairs parlour of a French grocer's house, sat on a chair beside a portrait that hung on the wall. The portrait was of him. His identity was, at that point, no longer in any real doubt. Several local officials gathered. They were not sure what to do. They sent messengers back to Paris. By morning, the answer arrived. The royal family was to be returned to Paris under guard. They were taken from the grocer's house, put back into their berlin, and driven slowly back the way they had come, in heat that grew steadily more brutal, in front of crowds angry. The journey back took 4 days. Crowds lined the road. Some shouted. Some stared in silence. Some threw things. A nobleman who attempted to greet the king at one of the relay stations was shot dead by the escorting guards in front of the royal family. The queen, who saw the killing from her window, did not, by the accounts of those present, react visibly. The royal family arrived in Paris on June 25, 1791, and were placed under stricter confinement in the Tuileries. The pretense that the king was a constitutional monarch governing in good faith was, after Varennes, very difficult for anyone to maintain. Until that moment, there had still been a real political possibility of a constitutional monarchy in France, with the king as head of state under a written constitution. After Varennes, that possibility was effectively dead. The king had attempted to flee his own country, his own people, his own constitution. The implication was that he could not be trusted as a constitutional monarch. The implication was that the monarchy itself, as an institution, was incompatible with the revolution. This implication would harden over the next year, and the radicalization of revolutionary politics, which until then had been balanced against more moderate forces, accelerated dramatically. Less than a month after the return from Varennes, on July 17, 1791, a Republican demonstration on the Champ de Mars in Paris turned bloody when National Guard troops under Lafayette's command opened fire on the crowd. The demonstrators had gathered to sign a petition demanding the king's deposition. The exact number of dead has been debated by historians. Estimates range from 12 to 50 or more, with many more wounded. The Champ de Mars massacre, as it came to be called, was a turning point in the politics of the moderate constitutionalists. It alienated the radicals. It exposed the contradictions of a constitutional government that had to use lethal force against citizens petitioning for its replacement. Lafayette himself never fully recovered politically from his role in ordering the firing. He would emigrate the following year, be captured by Austrian forces, and spend 5 years in foreign captivity before being released into a long political twilight that lasted until his death in 1834. The collapse of the moderate centre, which became visible after the Champ de Mars, removed one of the structural protections the royal family had relied on. The radicals were now, in effect, the only remaining political force capable of organising the streets, and the radicals had no interest in preserving the monarchy. In August 1791, Marie Antoinette's brother Leopold II, by then Holy Roman Emperor following the death of their older brother Joseph, met with King Frederick William II of Prussia at Pillnitz in Saxony. They issued a joint declaration, the Declaration of Pillnitz, in which they expressed concern about the situation of the French royal family and called on other European powers to take action. The declaration was deliberately vague and was largely intended as a diplomatic gesture rather than a real threat of intervention. But it was read in France as exactly such a threat, and it intensified the suspicion that the Queen in particular was in correspondence with foreign powers preparing to invade her own country, which, as we have seen, she was. The fact that she was doing so in good faith, from her own perspective, with the goal of restoring what she regarded as the legitimate order, did not weigh much against the perception that she was a foreign agent. The pamphleteers, who had been calling her the Austrian for years, now had a more direct accusation to make. She was conspiring with Vienna against France. The accusation was not entirely false. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria. The decision was driven by a complicated mix of motives, including the radicals' belief that a war would force the king's hand and reveal his true loyalties, and the moderates' belief that a successful war would consolidate the constitutional monarchy. Both groups, in different ways, were proven wrong. The war went badly for the French armies in its initial months. The Queen, who had been passing French military plans to her brother's diplomats, was widely suspected of treason and was, by the strict definition of the term, guilty. The political situation in Paris radicalized rapidly through the summer. In July 1792, a Prussian general named the Duke of Brunswick, commanding the Allied armies advancing toward France, issued a declaration that has come down in history as the Brunswick Manifesto. The text had been drafted in part with input from émigré French royalists. It threatened the city of Paris with total destruction if any harm came to the French royal family. The intention had been to intimidate the revolutionary government into restraint. The actual effect was the opposite. The manifesto was published widely in Paris, and its threats were read by the public as confirmation that the king and queen were in active collusion with foreign armies preparing to invade France and punish the city. Whatever protection the manifesto had been intended to offer the royal family, it provided the immediate political justification for the assault on the Tuileries that followed 3 weeks later. The Brunswick Manifesto is a classic example, in political history, of a measure that achieves the precise opposite of its intended effect because its authors did not understand the audience they were addressing. On August 10, 1792, a crowd of Parisians and provincial federates, supported by elements of the radical sections of the city, stormed the Tuileries Palace. The Royal Swiss Guards, who had been stationed to defend the palace, were ordered by the king not to fire on the attackers. They were, by the time he gave the order, already fighting for their lives. Several hundred of them were killed in the assault and the massacre that followed. The royal family, before the attack reached its peak, had been taken from the palace by a deputation of the Legislative Assembly and were sheltering in the Assembly's meeting hall. The monarchy was suspended that evening. The royal family was no longer the royal family. They were, from that moment on, prisoners of the revolution. They were transferred on August 13th, 1792, to the Temple, a medieval fortress in central Paris that had once belonged to the Knights Templar. It consisted of a tall keep, a smaller building called the Tower, and various administrative buildings. The royal family was housed initially in the Tower, although they would later be moved to the Great Tower as security was tightened. Their attendants were arrested, their movements were restricted, their visitors were controlled, their correspondence was monitored. Their lives, from that point onward, were in the hands of the revolutionary government. In early September 1792, while the royal family was being installed at the Temple, the news from the war turned worse. Prussian armies, which had been advancing toward Paris, threatened to break through the French defensive lines. The political situation in the city responded with the September massacres, during which crowds of revolutionaries broke into the prisons of Paris and slaughtered approximately 1,200 prisoners over the course of several days. Most of the victims were ordinary criminals. A substantial minority were political prisoners associated with the old regime. The killings were carried out by improvised tribunals operating in courtyards and corridors, with prisoners brought before panels of armed men, briefly questioned, and either sent free or pushed out of the door into a waiting line of executioners. The chaotic, unsystematic, and visibly drunken character of the proceedings appalled even some sympathetic observers of the revolution. It was in many ways the moment at which the revolution's claim to be a movement of justice broke down most visibly. There would be worse moments to come in the next few years, but the September massacres were the moment at which the radicalization of the previous year crossed into something that no observer with any moral seriousness could continue to defend on civic republican grounds. Among the victims of the September massacres was the Princesse de Lamballe, the Queen's friend of nearly 20 years, who had returned from a safe exile abroad earlier in the summer specifically to share her friend's fate. She was killed at the prison of La Force on September 3rd, 1792, in circumstances that I will not describe in detail because they do not need detail. Her head was carried through Paris on a pike and was, by some accounts, displayed beneath the Queen's window at the Temple. The Queen was protected from seeing it by guards who pulled her away from the window in time. She was told eventually what had happened to her friend. She did not, by the accounts of those present, say anything for a long time afterward. The royal family lived together in the Temple in cramped but functional rooms through the autumn of 1792. The king's valet, Jean-Baptiste Cléry, had been allowed to remain in service and would later write a detailed memoir of the Temple period that is one of the most important sources for what happened there. According to Cléry, the family established a routine. The king read history and geography to his son. He taught the boy mathematics and Latin. The Queen taught her daughter music and embroidery. Madame Elizabeth, the king's sister, who had chosen to share their imprisonment rather than escape, taught religion and led the family in prayers. They ate together. They walked together in a garden when permitted. They tried, in the space they had been given, to be a family. Cléry's memoir, which he published in London in 1798 after escaping from France, gives us our clearest picture of what daily life in the Temple was actually like. The king rose at 6 in the morning and went to bed at 11. He shaved himself. He read his breviary. He spent several hours each day in private study, working through volumes of Tacitus and other classical historians, books on the history of England that he had brought with him, and a collection of works of geography and natural history. He had been a serious reader all his life, and the imprisonment did not change this. If anything, it intensified his reading, because there was so little else to do. The Queen embroidered. She had brought tapestry frames into the Temple with her, and she worked on her embroidery for hours each day, producing pieces that were reportedly of considerable technical skill. Some of these embroideries survive, scattered in private collections and museums, and they bear the marks of her labour in the Temple in a way that is almost unbearable to consider when you encounter one in person. The boy Louis Charles was the family's emotional centre. He was 7 when they entered the Temple. He was a curious, bright, affectionate child who, by Cléry's account, adapted to the conditions of imprisonment with the natural elasticity of children. He played in the Temple garden when the weather permitted. He had a dog, a spaniel named Coco, who had been allowed to accompany the family. He invented games. He asked questions. He was, in those early months, the one source of light in the family's daily life. His older sister, Marie Theresa, who was 13 when they entered the Temple, was already a more solemn child, more conscious of the political situation, more reserved in her affections. The two children together, with their father reading to them and their mother embroidering nearby, formed an island of normality inside the Temple's medieval walls. There were guards in every room. There was no privacy. The doors of the family's apartments could not be locked from the inside. The locks had been removed when they arrived. Every word spoken in the family rooms was potentially overheard, and the family knew this. Conversations of any sensitive nature had to be conducted in writing, with notes passed silently between people in the same room and burned in the fireplace afterward. Clary, who passed many such notes himself, describes the labour of inventing innocent topics of conversation that could be safely spoken aloud while the real conversation was conducted on paper. The exhaustion of this dual existence, of having to perform for the guards while also living a real inner life among themselves, ground down the adults steadily over the course of the autumn and winter. The Queen attempted in those temple months to teach her children certain things she felt they would need. She taught her daughter to maintain her composure under any provocation, a skill she herself had spent her life acquiring. She taught her son to memorize names and faces, on the theory that one day, if he survived, he might need to recognize people who had been loyal to the family during these years. She taught both of them, simply, to behave with dignity in front of strangers. The lessons were not described as such. They were embedded in daily conversation, in corrections, in the example of her own conduct. The children absorbed them. Marie Theresa would carry them, recognizably, into her long later life. Louis Charles would not have time to. The legal proceedings against the king moved through the autumn and winter of 1792. The convention, which had succeeded the Legislative Assembly in September, debated whether the former king should be tried, by what procedure, and on what charges. The trial began in December. It was conducted before the convention itself, which served simultaneously as prosecutor, jury, and judge. The king was charged with treason against the French nation. The evidence included a cache of secret correspondence that had been discovered in a hidden iron safe at the Tuileries after the August storming, which contained letters from the king to foreign monarchs that contradicted his public oaths to the Constitution. The verdict, when it came, was effectively foreordained. He was found guilty by a substantial majority. The vote on the sentence was closer. By a margin of one vote in some interpretations, more in others, depending on how one counted the various conditional ballots, he was condemned to death. On January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution, the public square at the centre of Paris that had once been called the Place Louis XV and is today the Place de la Concorde. He had been tried, convicted, and condemned by the National Convention. He was 38 years old. He went to his death with the simple dignity that had always been his most underrated quality. He had spent the previous evening with his family in the temple, in a final meeting that lasted several hours. He had attempted to comfort them. He had asked his wife to forgive him for the death he could see coming for her also. He had embraced his children and asked them to forgive their enemies. He had broken down only once. He had told his son, who would now technically be Louis II at the age of 7, never to seek revenge for what was about to happen. He attempted a final speech from the scaffold. He said something like, "Frenchmen, I die innocent of all the crimes of which I am accused. I forgive those who have caused my death, and I pray that the blood you are about to shed may never fall back on France." He was cut off by a drum roll. He was, by every account of his last hours, calm. His wife, in the temple, was told of his death the same day. The accounts of how she received the news are restrained in their detail and devastating in their cumulative effect. She did not, the witnesses' report, cry out. She did not collapse. She sat very still for a long time. Then she began quietly to address her son, Louis Charles, by his new title. The 7-year-old boy in the temple was, in the eyes of royalist Europe, now King Louis XV. She acknowledged this. She kissed his hand. She did her best that evening and in the days that followed to arrange her remaining family around the new fact of her widowhood and her son's nominal kingship. She would never recover from this loss in any visible sense. From January 1793 onward, she dressed exclusively in mourning. The next few months in the temple were a tightening of conditions. The king's death had not satisfied the radicals. If anything, it had emboldened them to demand more. The war was still going badly. The French armies were under pressure on multiple frontiers. The internal political situation was descending into the early phases of what would become the Reign of Terror. The convention was systematically dismantling the moderate factions and consolidating power in the Committee of Public Safety, which would, by the summer of 1793, be effectively running the country. In all of this, the figure of the imprisoned queen and her son was a complicating factor. As long as they were alive, they were potential symbols around which any opposition might rally. The radicals wanted them disposed of. The moderates wanted them kept as bargaining chips for possible exchange with foreign powers. The result was a slow, increasingly cruel sequence of administrative measures aimed at reducing both their political utility and their personal dignity. In July of 1793, the situation became worse than even she had known it could be. The revolutionary authorities decided to separate her son from her. The justification was political. The boy was the symbolic head of the royalist movement, and his mother was in their view a corrupting influence on him who would raise him to despise the revolution. The actual mechanics of the separation were brutal. Guards came to her rooms at night. They took the child by force from his mother's arms. He cried. She begged. She was overruled. He was placed in another part of the temple under the supervision of a man named Antoine Simon, a cobbler of revolutionary sympathies, and his wife. The boy was 8 years old. He would never see his mother again. For the next several weeks, she could hear him through the walls of the temple. She could hear him crying at first, and then, after a while, she could hear him being taught by his guardians to sing revolutionary songs and to insult his own family. There is a detail from this period that I find almost impossible to write down, but I will tell you because it is true. She would sometimes climb on a piece of furniture in her room to look out of a high window in the hope of catching a glimpse of him being taken to the garden for exercise. She did this regularly for as long as she was housed in that wing of the temple. She would stand on the chair, or whatever was available, and she would wait, and sometimes she saw him for a few seconds, and sometimes she did not. On the night of August 1st, 1793, she was moved from the temple to the conciergerie, a much harsher prison on the Ile de la Cite in central Paris. She was placed in a ground-floor cell. She was given a straw mattress. She was watched continuously by guards who did not leave her room, even when she dressed or attended to her bodily needs. She was by this point suffering from severe internal hemorrhages, almost certainly from a form of uterine cancer or fibroid disease. She was bleeding constantly. The conditions were unsanitary. She knew, by every signal she was given, that the trial that was coming would have only one outcome. There was a moment of hope, briefly. In early September 1793, a group of royalist sympathisers, working from the outside, had developed a plan to bribe key guards and smuggle her out of the conciergerie. The plan came close to working. A senior guard had been recruited. A signal had been arranged. The plan was discovered at the last moment, by accident, when a junior officer noticed something irregular and reported it. The conspirators were arrested. Several were executed. The Queen's conditions after the discovery of the plan were tightened further. She was moved to a smaller, more closely watched cell. The screen that had been provided for her to dress behind was removed. The straw mattress was replaced. A large guard was stationed inside her cell at all times, watching her continuously. She was permitted no further private moments of any kind. She had nothing left to be taken from her except her life. Her trial began on October 14, 1793, and lasted 2 days. The proceedings were held in the Hall of the Revolution, in the Palais de Justice, the same building as the conciergerie. She was led from her cell to the courtroom each day. The presiding judge was Marshal Herman. The prosecutor was Antoine Quentin Fouquier Tinville, who was already by this point the chief instrument of the Reign of Terror's judicial apparatus. The defence was conducted by 2 lawyers, Claude Chauveau-Lagarde and Guillaume Alexandre Tronçon du Coudray, who had been appointed to the case the day before the trial began and who had had no real opportunity to prepare a defence. They did what they could. They were not, in the circumstances, going to be able to do much. The courtroom was crowded throughout the 2 days. Spectators filled the public gallery. Journalists from the revolutionary press took notes for the next morning's papers. The accused sat on a bench, raised so that the courtroom could see her, with her hands folded in her lap. She was dressed in a simple white dress with a black ribbon at her waist. Her hair, which had gone almost entirely grey during her months at the conciergerie despite her age, was hidden under a white cap. She had been ill for weeks. She was hemorrhaging continuously. She did not, by any account from the proceedings, complain of any of this. The witnesses called by the prosecution had been gathered from a wide range of sources. Some were genuine, court servants who had seen events at Versailles and the Tuileries and could testify to incidents. Others were political, figures from the radical clubs who came to denounce her on general grounds. The most damaging single witness on the formal political charges was probably the former mayor of Paris, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who had himself been arrested by this point and who would be executed a few weeks later. Bailly testified about the events of October 5th and 6th, 1789, and about what he had observed of the Queen's conduct in the period between Versailles and the Tuileries. His testimony was reluctant, factual, and on the whole more sympathetic than the prosecution had hoped. He was a serious man placed in an impossible position, and his discomfort with the proceedings was visible to the courtroom. The most notorious witness was Jacques-René Hebert, the radical journalist who edited the newspaper Le Père Duchesne and who had been one of the principal architects of the political campaign to have the Queen tried. Hebert testified about the alleged sexual abuse, presenting a written statement supposedly made by the 8-year-old Louis Charles in the Temple under the supervision of his guardian Antoine Simon. The statement was an obvious forgery in its claims, although the boy may indeed have been induced, by methods we can only guess at, to put his name to something. Hebert delivered his testimony with the type of theatrical vehemence that had made his newspaper a popular sensation. The prosecutor pressed the Queen for a response. The Queen said nothing. The prosecutor demanded an answer. She turned in the courtroom to the women in the gallery, and she said something that has come down through history in different versions but with the same essential meaning. She said that if she had not answered the accusation, it was because nature itself refused to answer such an accusation made against any mother. And she appealed directly to the mothers in the room. The room, by the accounts of those present, went briefly silent. Some of the women in the gallery wept. Even some of the journalists who were openly hostile to her, recording the trial for the revolutionary press, noted afterward that her response had been dignified and that the accusation had been a serious miscalculation by the prosecution. Robespierre himself, when he heard about the moment later, is reported to have been furious with Hebert, who had been the principal architect of the cruel charge. He said, in private, that Hebert had been an idiot, that the charge had been pointless, and that all it had done was give the prisoner a chance to look noble. The verdict, of course, did not change, but the moment changed something. It would be one of the moments people would remember about her, even people who had wanted her dead. The defense lawyers, Chauveau-Lagarde and Tronçon-Ducoudray, did what they could during the 2 days. They challenged charges where the evidence was thin. They pointed out procedural irregularities. Chauveau-Lagarde, in his closing argument, attempted a careful, lawyerly defense that focused on the legal definitions of the offences charged. The argument was not bad. It was simply being delivered in a venue where legal arguments were not what was being decided. Both lawyers were arrested immediately after the trial concluded, by the way, on the grounds that any lawyer who had defended the Queen had thereby revealed himself to be politically suspect. Chauveau-Lagarde survived. Tronçon-Ducoudray was eventually released as well. Both lawyers were arrested immediately after the trial concluded, by the way, on the grounds that any lawyer who had defended the Queen had thereby revealed himself to be politically suspect. Chauveau-Lagarde survived. Tronçon-Ducoudray was eventually released as well. But the message of their arrests was clear, and it was the same message that had been sent throughout the trial. This was not a legal proceeding. So it was a political ritual whose outcome had been decided before it began. The rest of the trial moved through the other charges with a kind of mechanical inevitability. Witnesses were called. Documents were produced. The defense lawyers attempted to challenge what they could. The prosecutor delivered a long closing speech. The verdict was returned in the early hours of October 16, 1793. She was condemned to death. She returned to her cell. She wrote a long letter in the few hours she had remaining to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth, who was still being held in the temple. The letter has survived. It is one of the most extraordinary documents of the revolutionary period. In it, she expresses her love for her children, asks her sister-in-law to take care of them as best she can, expresses forgiveness for her enemies, and asks God to forgive her for whatever errors she may have committed. Soft tone, she apologizes for any pain she has caused. She sends her blessings. She is, in this letter, calmer and more lucid than most of us would be in any version of what was happening to her. She concludes with a moving passage in which she says that she dies in the Catholic faith of her ancestors, that she forgives those who have wronged her, and that she hopes her son will never seek revenge for her death, the same instruction her husband had given his son before his own execution. The letter was confiscated by the revolutionary authorities and never delivered. It was found, decades later, among the papers of the chief prosecutor Fouquier-Tinville after his own execution. It was preserved. It was eventually published. It is now in the French National Archives. Madame Elisabeth, who was herself executed in May 1794, never knew that her sister-in-law had written it. The morning of October 16th, 1793 was cold and clear in Paris. She was prepared for execution in her cell. Soft-toned, her hair was cut short at the back of her neck so that the blade of the guillotine would have an unobstructed path. Her hands were bound behind her back in a deliberate departure from the custom that had been observed for her husband, who had been allowed to walk to the scaffold with his hands free. She was placed in an open cart, called a tumbril, drawn by a single horse. She was driven through the streets of Paris from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution. The route took her past landmarks she had known in her former life. The Pont Neuf, the Tuileries, where she had lived for nearly 3 years after being driven from Versailles, the Place Vendôme. The route had been chosen, by some accounts deliberately, to take her through parts of Paris where she would be most visible to the largest crowds. The journey took approximately an hour and a half. The streets were crowded. Some shouted abuse. Some stared. Some, the records suggest, were silent. She rode upright. She did not weep. She did not, by the report of every witness who left a record, show fear. There is a famous sketch of her, made on the day by the painter Jacques-Louis David, who watched the tumbril pass from a window. The sketch shows her in profile, hands bound, sitting straight, her hair shorn, her expression composed and almost severe. David, who was a committed revolutionary and who had voted for her husband's death the previous January, did not draw her sympathetically. He drew what he saw. Or soft-tone, what he saw was a woman who had decided to face what was coming without giving her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her broken. At the scaffold, she climbed the steps without help. As she was being positioned at the guillotine, she stepped accidentally on the foot of the executioner, a man named Henri Sanson, who had also executed her husband. She is reported to have said to him quietly that she was sorry, that she had not meant to do it. These are recorded as her last words. She was executed at approximately 12:15 in the afternoon. She was 37 years old. I want to leave a moment of silence around that. Not because the moment itself deserves drama. The actual moment, by the accounts of those present, was not dramatic. It was a procedure carried out efficiently in front of a crowd that was, by the autumn of 1793, somewhat numb to the procedure. Soft-toned, but because we have just spent a long time with a human being, and the abruptness with which a human being is ended on a scaffold is something the historical record does not really equip us to absorb at full speed. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a churchyard near the place of execution, the Madeleine Cemetery, in a layer of quicklime designed to dissolve her body. After the restoration of the Bourbons in 1815, her remains and those of her husband were exhumed, identified by the fragments of clothing and a single garter that survived, and reinterred at the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional burial place of the kings and queens of France. The exhumation itself, which took place on January 18th, 1815, in the presence of officials and of her surviving daughter, Marie Theresa, was and dignified procedure that took place in a corner of the old cemetery that had by then become overgrown. The remains were placed in lead-lined coffins and transferred in a procession through the streets of Paris to the basilica that had been the burial place of every king of France since the early Middle Ages. A chapel in the Madeleine area, the Chapelle Expiatoire, was later built on the site of the original cemetery as a memorial to the executed royal family. It can be visited today. It is not visited often. It is one of the quieter sites in Paris. I want to take some time now, before we close, to follow what happened to the people she left behind, because the story of a person does not really end with their death. It continues in the lives of the people who were in the room. Her son Louis Charles, the boy through whose bedroom wall she had listened in the temple, would die in 1795 at the age of 10. The cause was a combination of tuberculosis, neglect, and the deliberate cruelty of his guardians. After his mother's execution, the political utility of keeping him alive declined. Soft tone, his existence was an embarrassment to the radical revolutionaries, who had no wish to maintain a Bourbon prince in their custody, but his execution was politically impossible because of the international outrage it would have provoked. The compromise, never explicitly stated as policy but visible in the daily treatment of the boy, was to allow him to die slowly of medical neglect. He was kept in a single room in the temple for the last year of his life. He was rarely permitted to wash. He was not allowed exercise. He developed sores. He was not given adequate medical attention until very near the end. He died on June 8, 1795. He had not seen his mother for nearly 2 years. He had not seen his sister, who was in the same building, for almost as long. He had been told repeatedly by his various guardians that his parents had been criminals and that he should not love them. The boy who died was no longer by the end recognizable as the same child who had been taken from his mother's arms in July 1793. The illness, the neglect, and the relentless emotional pressure of his last years had broken him down to almost nothing. He was buried in an unmarked grave in another Parisian cemetery. His sister, Marie Theresa, would survive imprisonment. She remained in the temple in a separate cell until December 1795, when she was exchanged for French prisoners of war held by the Austrians. She was 17 by the time she left France. She had been a prisoner since she was 11. She lived with her Habsburg cousins in Vienna for several years, and then with the exiled French royalist court in various European cities. She married her cousin, Louis-Antoine, the eldest son of her father's younger brother, in 1799. She was Dauphine of France briefly, during the brief reign of her uncle Louis XVIII after the Bourbon Restoration of 1815, and she was very nearly Queen of France during the abortive reign of her father-in-law in 1830. She lived until 1851. Soft tone, she was 72 when she died. She had outlived her parents by 58 years. She did not, in her long life, speak at length about her time in the temple. There are letters in which she alludes to it. There are not many. Cerise's delivery makes him arbelain, because ombud austere. Her colds about moist. Herkel sip like, Hosang. Unsoaked bantry, old downstream belike, and prickfence divulged spun soul. She wrote a memoir of her time in the temple, in a journal which was discovered after her death, and which is one of the primary sources for what happened to the royal family in those years. The memoir is almost unbearably restrained. She does not dwell on cruelty. She does not narrate suffering. She records what was done to her parents and her brother in the simplest, most factual prose she can manage, and the restraint is itself the testimony. Madame Elizabeth, the king's sister who had chosen to share the family's imprisonment, was tried and executed on May 10th, 1794, 6.5 months after Marie Antoinette. She was 30 years old. She had refused, at her own trial, to renounce her royalist convictions or to express any regret for her support of her brother. She was a deeply religious woman who, by all accounts, went to her death with serenity. Soft tone. She was the last member of the immediate royal family to be killed by the revolution. Soft-tone Fersen, the Queen's friend, lived for another 17 years. He returned to Sweden after the events in France and resumed a senior career at the Swedish court. He was killed in 1810 in a brutal public attack in Stockholm by a mob who blamed him, on no real evidence, for the death of the heir to the Swedish throne. His last years had been emotionally desolate. He had never married. He had kept Queen's letters to him in a locked box. Soft tone, he had visited her grave in Paris during the brief period after the Restoration. He had written in one of the late entries in his journal that the day he received the news of her execution was the worst day of his life, and that he had never recovered from it. The Bourbon dynasty itself was restored in 1815, with the Queen's brother-in-law taking the throne as Louis XVIII. He reigned until his death in 1824. He soft-toned. He was succeeded by his younger brother, the Queen's other brother-in-law, who reigned as Charles X until 1830, when a second French Revolution drove him into exile. The Bourbon Restoration was, from the perspective of someone interested in the Queen's memory, the period during which her reputation was actively rehabilitated. Her remains were reinterred at Saint-Denis with full state honours. The Chapelle Expiatoire was built. Memorial masses were held annually on the anniversary of her execution. Memoirs by people who had known her, including her ladies-in-waiting and her friends, were published in large numbers. The image of her, in this period, was that of a martyred saint. The pamphlets that had destroyed her were now suppressed and forgotten. The public memory was in effect reset. When the Bourbon Restoration ended in 1830, the rehabilitation that had been built around her began slowly to give way again to a more critical assessment. The 19th century, especially the second half, was a period of growing Republican sympathies in France, and the figure of the executed Queen became, in Republican historiography, less a martyr and more a symbol of the corrupt old order. The pamphlets that had been suppressed under the Restoration began to be quoted again, often without proper context. The phrase "let them eat cake," which had been firmly attributed to her by the middle of the 19th century, although there was no contemporary evidence for the attribution, became a standard part of any school textbook discussion of the Revolution. By the late 19th century, the image of her in popular culture was again largely negative. It would oscillate throughout the 20th century between the two extremes: martyr in some accounts, monster in others, fool or victim in others again, depending on the politics of the writer and the mood then. The most influential modern biography of her was published by the Austrian writer Stefan Zweig in 1932, Antonia Fraser's Marie Antoinette. The Journey, published in 2001, is the standard modern English language account, deeply researched and sympathetic without being uncritical. Caroline Wieker's Queen of Fashion, published in 2006, focused specifically on the role of clothing in her public life and made a strong case for taking her wardrobe choices seriously as political acts. Dozens of other biographies, monographs, and edited collections have appeared in recent decades. So historiographical consensus has shifted in the last 40 or 50 years toward a more sympathetic and more politically aware reading of her life. She is now generally recognized by serious historians as a complex human being whose role in the events that destroyed her was substantially more limited than the popular image suggests. The popular image, of course, has not entirely caught up. The 2006 film by Sofia Coppola, Marie Antoinette, starring Kirsten Dunst, was the most prominent attempt in recent years to bring a sympathetic, modernized reading of her to a wide audience. The film took stylistic liberties, including a soundtrack of post-punk and new wave music played over scenes of court life that some critics found jarring. But it captured something genuine about the texture of her experience, the way that very young women can be installed at the center of public attention and then judged harshly for not having developed the maturity to handle it. The film was divisive. It was probably correct in its essential reading more often than its critics gave it credit for. So now I want to take the last part of this conversation to do something the example of her life almost demands, which is to stop and ask honestly, what does it mean? Because the popular image of Marie Antoinette, the Marie Antoinette of phrases and films and tea towels, is a screen against which the actual woman is invisible, and I think we owe her, after spending this long with her, a few honest minutes of looking at her without the screen in the way. The most famous phrase associated with her, the one almost everyone in the English-speaking world will say if you ask them what they know about her, is "let them eat cake." The story is that, on being told that the people of France had no bread, she replied that they should eat cake instead, the implication being that she was so out of touch with the reality of her subjects' lives that she did not even understand what bread shortages meant. The phrase is, in popular memory, the perfect summary of her supposed obliviousness. It is also, almost certainly, something she never said. The earliest known appearance of the phrase, in something close to its modern form, is in the Confessions of the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in a passage that Rousseau wrote in the late 1760s about a great princess he claimed to remember from his childhood. Rousseau wrote those words before Marie Antoinette had ever set foot in France. He never attributed the saying to her. The princess he was describing, if she existed at all, would have been someone he might have encountered in his youth before Marie Antoinette was born. The attribution to Marie Antoinette specifically does not appear in the historical record until the mid-19th century, decades after her death, in revolutionary memoirs of doubtful reliability. There is no evidence that she ever said anything resembling this. There is in fact considerable evidence that she was actively concerned about the price of bread and the welfare of the poor in her later years, and that she made charitable donations of a kind that, if you knew about them, would somewhat complicate the image of her as a woman who did not care. So why does the phrase stick? Why does almost everyone reading this know it before they know any other fact about her life? I think the answer is that the phrase is doing work for us, not for her. The phrase "let them eat cake" is not really about Marie Antoinette. It is about a fantasy we have, a useful fantasy, of a kind of person who exists at the top of an unjust system, and who does not understand the system she is sitting on top of. The phrase is shorthand. It allows us to look at any unequal society and locate the cause of its injustice in the moral failure of a number of frivolous people at the top, rather than in the harder structural facts of how societies are organized. If the Queen had only understood, the implication runs, she would have helped. She did not understand, and so she had to be guillotined, and now we have moved on to better arrangements. This is in the end a very comforting story. It is also a dishonest one. Marie Antoinette was not the cause of the structural problems of pre-revolutionary France. She was, at most, a minor contributor to a problem that was generations in the making, that involved tax structures designed centuries before her birth, that involved demographic and economic shifts that were international in scope, that involved the failures of the French state to manage its finances after the American War. She did not invent any of those problems. She also could not, even if she had been the wisest queen in European history, have solved them by personal example. The notion that she could have, the notion that her execution was a corrective to the actual problems of her society, is one of the more durable lies that the French Revolution told about itself. The structural problems remained. The terror was not bred. And yet she dies, and the phrase "she did not say" lives, and the phrase becomes, in the popular mind, the entire summary of who she was. There is a kind of historical injustice in this that I find hard to accept even after researching it carefully. The actual woman gets compressed 2.5 centuries after her death into a sentence she never spoke. The pamphlets she could not respond to in her lifetime are still, in a sense, being printed. What was she actually like? Soft tone has tried in this script to give you some sense of it without overcorrecting. She was warm. She was emotionally generous. She was loyal to her friends, sometimes too loyal, in ways that involved her in the petty politics of court factionalism, in ways she did not handle skillfully. She was a burnt mother, especially after the early period of her marriage, in a court culture where and present mothering was not the expected pattern for queens. Soft tone. She had genuine taste in music, in fashion, and in interior design, and her commissions in those areas have left some of the most beautiful surviving artifacts of late 18th century French culture. She was not stupid, but she was not deeply educated, and she was at her worst in arguments that required patience with detail. She was capable of cruelties and capable of kindnesses in roughly the proportions you would expect of any human being. She was in her last years dignified in a way that, at the time, surprised the people who had been assigned to destroy her. She was, in other words, a person, not a saint, not a monster, not a symbol. Just a person, born into a position she had not chosen, doing her best in circumstances that exceeded her preparation, making mistakes that would have been forgivable in a private life, and that became unforgivable when projected onto the public stage of an entire kingdom. The miracle of her, looked at honestly, is not that she was perfect. The miracle is that she was, by the end, recognizably brave. Soft-toned as she walked up the steps of the scaffold with her hands tied behind her back, that she apologized to her executioner for stepping on his foot, that she had, in the last hours of her life, the presence of mind to write a letter to her sister-in-law about the welfare of her children that has survived as one of the most moving documents in the entire revolutionary archive. None of that was guaranteed by the way she was raised. None of that was a logical extension of the spoiled girl in the early pamphlets. She found that strength somewhere, in the dark, in the years of imprisonment, and she carried it to the end, and the people who had condemned her could not take it from her. This is, I think, what the popular image misses. Not that she was good, exactly, but that she was real, that she was a 14-year-old girl on an island in the Rhine, and a young queen at Versailles, and a woman who lost 3 children, and a widow in a black dress in a cold cell, and finally a 37-year-old woman in a tumbrel on the way to the guillotine, who went to her death without weeping. All of those people were the same person. All of them are owed our attention. There are several smaller reflections I want to leave you with as we close. The first concerns the relationship between her story and the wider story of the French Revolution. There is a temptation, in any account of an individual at the centre of a great public event, to treat the individual as either the cause or the symbol of the event. Marie Antoinette is sometimes treated as a cause of the revolution, on the theory that her extravagance bankrupted the state. This is not really true. The state was bankrupted by structural fiscal problems much larger than her personal expenditure, and she was not, in any meaningful sense, the architect of those problems. She is more often treated as a symbol of the revolution, on the theory that her execution represented the ending of the old order. There is more to say for this reading, but even it is not fully adequate to her actual experience. She was not a symbol to herself. She was a person to whom these things were happening. The temptation to read her as a representative of an idea rather than as a human being who lived a life is one we should resist. Her story is not made more interesting by being abstracted into political theory. It is made less interesting. The detail, the facts of her actual life, are what make her real. The second concerns the question of what we can learn from her, if anything. I am suspicious of attempts to draw simple lessons from historical lives, especially historical lives that ended badly. The temptation, with someone like Marie Antoinette, is to extract a moral about the dangers of luxury, or the consequences of being out of touch with one's people, or the importance of political adaptability. These morals have some merit, but they are also too neat. They imply that if she had only behaved differently, she might have survived. This is, on the historical evidence, very unlikely. The forces that destroyed her were larger than any individual could have managed. The most politically gifted queen in European history, placed in her exact position, would probably have ended in the same place. What she could have controlled was, perhaps, the tone of her personal conduct in the last years. She could have been more dignified, or more humble, or more visibly attentive to the suffering of the poor. None of that, almost certainly, would have saved her. The revolution was not asking her to perform better, it was asking her to disappear. The third concerns the question of how we should feel about her now, 2 centuries later, in a world that has moved past the political conditions that produced her. I think the honest answer is that we should feel something complicated, not pity, exactly, because pity is the wrong register for someone who, in her own lifetime, would have been deeply offended by being pitied. Not admiration, exactly, because she did not lead a life that we could reasonably hold up as a model. Something closer to recognition that she existed, recognition that she was a human being who experienced things that human beings experience. Zest of tone recognition that the simplifications that have been made about her in the centuries since her death have done her a kind of injustice that we have the capacity to undo in our ways by reading about her carefully and by refusing to repeat the simplifications. That is not a grand task. It is a task. But there are millions of historical people for whom that task is, in the end, the only kind of justice still available. There is a final reflection I want to leave you with, and it has to do with something the example of her life keeps returning me to, which is the question of what happens to a person who is asked to embody an institution. We tend to think, in modern democratic societies, that we have done away with the kinds of pressures that destroyed Marie Antoinette. We have not. We have simply distributed them differently. So soft tone, we still ask individual human beings, especially women, to stand in for entire systems they did not design, to absorb the public fury that those systems generate, and to perform a kind of inhuman steadiness in the face of criticism that no human being could honestly sustain. The mechanisms have changed, the cameras and the social media accounts, and the round-the-clock commentary are not the pamphlets of revolutionary Paris, but they share certain features. Of soft tone they build a public version of a person, often inaccurate, often actively malicious, that the actual person cannot correct. They create the conditions under which mistakes become career-ending, and under which what would in private life be ordinary failures of judgment become national emergencies. They reward simplification. They reward cruelty. They generate moods that, once they have set, can carry consequences that the individual at the centre of them is not given the time to escape. I am not arguing that any modern figure is in the same situation as a queen in the temple. They are not. The mechanisms are slower, and the stakes are usually lower. But the structure of the relationship between a public and a person it has chosen to project its frustrations onto is older than the French Revolution, and it has not gone away. We still do this. We still occasionally do it to people who, like Marie Antoinette, are not innocent and not guilty, and not really able to be the things we are demanding they be. Soft tone. The revolution itself, by the way, did this not only to her. Less than a month after Marie Antoinette's execution, on November 8, 1793, a woman named Manon Roland was guillotined in the same Place de la Révolution. Madame Roland had been one of the most influential women of the early Revolution, the wife of a Girondin minister, and the unofficial intellectual centre of the moderate Republican faction. So at home, she had run a salon in Paris that had been the meeting place of nearly every significant political figure on the moderate left in the early 1790s. She had been, in her own way, a Republican, a believer in constitutional government, a writer of considerable ability who had drafted many of her husband's official papers. She had also, like the Queen she would have indignantly refused to be compared with, been the target of relentless personal attacks in the radical press in the months before her arrest. She was accused of secretly running her husband's ministry, of corrupting moderate politicians through sexual influence, of conspiring against the unity of the Republic. The accusations had been in the main similar in form to those levelled at Marie Antoinette, although directed against a woman from a different social class with different political convictions. The pattern was the same. A woman at the visible centre of an institution had become the target through which the institution itself was attacked. Madame Roland is reported to have looked, on the way to the scaffold, at the Statue of Liberty that had been erected in the square, and to have said something that has come down through history in various forms but with the same essential meaning. Liberty. What crimes are committed in your name? The phrase has been quoted ever since as a kind of summary of the disillusionment of the more thoughtful figures of the Revolution as it descended into the Terror. The fact that she said it, on her way to her own execution, ordered by a government she had until recently been a part of, gives the phrase a weight. She and Marie Antoinette had been on opposite sides of almost every issue in the political life of France for the previous 5 years. They were now in the end in the same place, killed by the same machine, for crimes that were essentially symbolic rather than real. Olympe de Gouges, the playwright and pamphleteer who had written the Declaration of the Rights of Woman in 1791, was guillotined 4 days after Marie Antoinette. She too had been a Republican, a believer in the Revolution, a critic of the Queen's politics. She had also, in her last published works, dared to criticize Robespierre and to argue that the Terror was a betrayal of the principles that had originally justified the Revolution. The radical press had attacked her in the same way they had attacked the Queen, with the same imputations of moral degeneracy, the same insinuations about her sexual conduct, the same generalized contempt that the political culture of the age reserved for any woman who had become publicly visible. She went to the scaffold a few days after the woman she had spent years criticizing, and the women who watched the executions from the same gallery would have noticed, even if they did not say so out loud, that the categories of friend and enemy had become very difficult to maintain. What I take from this is that the destruction of public women in the political moment of late 1793 was not actually about Marie Antoinette specifically. So it was about a culture that had developed over the previous decades a set of techniques for destroying women who had become symbols, regardless of which side of the political conflict those women happened to be on. The queen and the salon hostess and the playwright were killed by the same techniques, in the same place, in the same fall, for symbolic reasons that, when examined honestly, had very little to do with the actual conduct of any of the three of them. The revolution had inherited these techniques from the old regime. The old regime had inherited them from much further back. They are still in altered forms with us. What we can take from her story, I think, is a kind of caution. A caution about the stories we tell ourselves about people we have decided to dislike. A soft tone about the certainty we sometimes feel when a public figure has been thoroughly described to us by sources we trust, that we know what kind of person they really are. A caution about how easily a sentence she never said can become the only thing anyone remembers about her. A caution about how thin the line is between the public image we are given and the actual human being underneath it. There is one last image I want to leave you with, not from the day of her execution, from a much earlier day when she was 23 years old, and her first daughter Marie Theresa, who would be the only one of her 4 children to survive her, had just been born. The soft tone time. The court at Versailles had been waiting through the public birth in the crowded room, and the news had been announced, and the mother had recovered from her near fainting, and the immediate excitement had subsided. A few hours later, in the relative of her private apartments, with most of the courtiers gone, the Queen was permitted to hold her newborn daughter in her arms for the first time without an audience. Soft tone. She is reported to have spoken to the baby, very softly, in a voice that the few attendants present could barely hear. She said something like, "Poor little thing, you were not what was wished for, but you will be no less dear to me on that account. A girl shares her mother's destinies. A son would have belonged to the state." Soft tone she did not. When she said this, know that her son, when he came, would also belong, in the end, to the state, and that the state would take him from her. She did not know that the daughter she was holding would be the one who lived. She knew only that she had, for the first time in 8 years of marriage, produced a child, and that the child was a girl, and that the girl would, for a few minutes, be allowed to be just a baby in her mother's arms. Soft tone. That is the version of her I want you to keep. If you keep any version, not the Queen, not the symbol, not the woman in the cart, just a young mother, in a room from which most of the witnesses have at last withdrawn, talking softly to a baby who will never hear about her in any way that matters, telling her, as quietly as she can, that she is loved. Thank you for being here for this one. I know it was long, and I know it was in places hard to listen to. Marie Antoinette is one of those subjects that, once you start really looking, becomes considerably more difficult than the popular version had led you to expect. If anything in this story stayed with you, if any image or moment or piece of detail made you see her differently than you did before, I would love to hear about it in the comments. This series is built on people being willing to sit with stories like this one. Your willingness to do that is what keeps it possible. There is another story coming. Another life. Another era. Another long evening of looking at someone we thought we knew. I will see you there.